And I believe you have been previously sworn, Mr. Osenkowski?
I have.
You remain under oath. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just a few preliminary questions. Mr. Osenkowski, you've testified before in this matter, correct?
Correct.
And you remain employed with DEM?
Yes,
And you still remain the Deputy Chief of Wildlife at DEM?
that's correct.
And you contributed to drafting portions of DEM's advisory opinion and supplemental advisory opinion?
That's correct.
And specifically regarding today's line of questioning, the questions posed to DEM were, one, the impact on fish and wildlife that will be caused by disruption of the habitat. Two, the impact of the proposed facility on state conservation priorities and plans, fish and wildlife habitats, and rare species, including those identified in the Rhode Island Natural Heritage Database. And then three, the cumulative environmental impacts of the proposed facility given the relative proximity of the proposed facility to the existing Ocean State Power Plant and the Algonquin Compressor Station. Did you contribute to those questions?
Yes,
And in preparation for your testimony today, did you review DEM's advisory opinion and supplemental advisory opinion?
yes,
And regarding those three questions, has your opinion as listed in those advisory opinions changed?
no, it has not.
And then with regards to DEM's advisory opinion, Christopher Rayfield was listed as contributing to the opinion regarding the state-listed species. Was that correct?
That's correct.
And Mr. Rayfield is no longer employed with DEM?
He's retired.
And do you agree with those conclusions in DEM's advisory opinions as it relates to state-listed species?
Yes.
I now tender the witness for questions.
Thank you.
CLF has no questions for this witness.
OER has no questions.
Thank you, Chairperson. The town has a few. Thank you for coming back, Mr. Osenkowski. As you know, I'm the attorney for the town of Burrillville. My name is Mike McElroy. Could we talk a little bit more? I don't think we've ever actually gone into any detail on your education, training, and experience. Well, what is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's in environmental science and a master's in conservation biology. Want non-educational background, or is that?
If you have training in the areas in which you'll be testifying today, that'd be great.
I've been working for the Department of Environmental Management for 19 years with the Division of Fish and Wildlife since 2004. Prior to that, I worked on endangered species in Hawaii and Neotropical forested birds in New Hampshire. I worked extensively in Rhode Island monitoring for offshore wind. Prior to DEM and during this time, I have several grad students working on species related to offshore wind impacts. I could go on, but...
Do you serve on any related boards or commissions?
I've been serving on a municipal planning board for 15 years. Prior to that, I was on a conservation commission, and prior to that, land trust. I was also an environmental consultant for a local wetland environmental consulting firm.
Thank you. Could we look at, and maybe we could bring up on the screen, the original DEM advisory opinion, please, and I'm going to start on page 9. Do you have a hard copy, Mr. Osenkowski?
I believe so, yeah.
So we can go right to page 9. And kind of as a preface, you may have been told that you're kind of a star. An awful lot of areas of the advisory opinion have previously been brought to our attention that you're the guy to ask the questions of. So I tried to make the best notes that I could every time you got thrown under the bus on these things, and I hope I'm right, but if
I think you're being misled, but...
Oh, well, this is why I'm going to caution you that I'm going to go through those areas that, based on my notes, we were referred to you.
Okay.
If it's incorrect, and if that's not an area that you're familiar with or comfortable testifying on, just let me know, okay?
Okay.
All right, so let's start on page 9. And as you can see at the top, It's the impact on fish and wildlife that will be caused by the disruption of the habitat, and the impact of the proposed facility on the state conservation priorities and plans, fish and wildlife habitats, and rare species, including those identified in the Rhode Island Natural Heritage Database. Those are the questions posed to DEM by this board. And are you comfortable testifying on those?
Yes.
All right, good. Now, going down to the second paragraph on the background, DEM combined the two advisory opinions that were requested by this board due to the fact that they were interrelated and overlapped, correct?
That's correct.
Let's go to page 10. So the heading says value of forests in the northwest corner. And it says that the value of the interior forest in the northwest corner of Rhode Island has been known to DEM for decades. Large undeveloped tracts of land and corridors to connect those tracts of land are vital to the conservation of biodiversity. Fish and wildlife rely on habitat connectivity to find scarce resources, preserve gene flow, and locate alternatives to lost habitat. And do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Could you explain that just a little bit more, how that habitat connectivity works and how it relates to this particular site?
Okay. Habitat connectivity is critically important to wildlife populations across the world. It's imperative. There's actually a lot of peer-reviewed published literature on this and describing the importance of connectivity for species to move and evolve and find adequate habitats. In light of, most relevant would be climate change impacts that we're dealing with now. It's imperative that species can move from one habitat that may no longer serve as adequate to fulfill their needs to other habitats, and or disperse to find mates to breed. And the other portion of that is to create a robust gene pool. So that they can compete with stressors from the environment or from disease. So those are reasons why having connected habitats are so vitally important to the persistence of populations.
And how does that relate to this particular proposed site?
Related to this site, as you stated and has been described, DEM has long recognized this is an important area. Both from a core area perspective in that it's within the context of southern New England and Rhode Island, it's largely unfragmented. So there's large protected areas of forest in particular. But then related specifically to this site within this larger context of southern New England, this site kind of falls within a funnel pinch point portion of this connected habitat, and so that's vitally important because the repercussions of cutting off an area so that species can no longer immigrate, and disperse could become detrimental to any local populations.
You mentioned a core area. What do you mean by a core area?
So typically, in the wildlife biology world, when we speak of core areas, we're usually referring to areas that are largely unfragmented. So it's a particular habitat type or a matrix of habitats, but that there's not disturbance, typically what I would refer to as human disturbance. So there's not urbanization within that area. Which the factors that come with urbanization we spoke about last time I was here: light pollution, noise pollution, degradation of habitat, spread of invasive species. So.
Now, the next paragraph refers to DEM's Division of Planning and Development's publication entitled "Protecting Our Land Resources, a Land Acquisition and Protection Plan for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management," referred to as the Land Acquisition Plan, that was published in May of 1996. And it says that this document identified biodiversity focus areas in the state, the largest of which is referred to as the Western Forest. Now, does the Western Forest include the area that this plan is being proposed for?
Yes.
goes down just before the quote, and it says that the plan asserted the following, and the first two sentences say, the continuity of the primarily forested landscape in this focus area provides the spatial requirements of a number of species that rely on large habitat tracts. Species of particular interest in this focus area include birds, especially neotropical migrants, which are also forest interior specialists, some found nowhere else in the state. Correct?
That's correct.
I'd like to break this apart a little bit and ask you a few questions about it so you could help educate me on this. Species of particular interest include neotropical migrants. What are they?
Neotropical migrants are in the context of what, as you referred, generally forested birds that prefer core big area forests and migrate, so they'll typically breed in our state in the summer and then migrate to tropical areas, the Caribbean, South Central America during the winter. So generally when you speak about neotropicals, it's not all inclusive, but many of those species are species that rely on large contiguous forests.
Like this area?
Like this area.
And it says that neotropical migrants are also forest interior specialists. What does that mean?
Meaning that they need forested habitat that's unfragmented, large contiguous forested habitat.
And you say they need them. They need them in order to breed, in order to survive. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yep. So the size area requirements vary by species, so it's not one size fits all, and it's hard to describe. There's no kind of lump. What we do know is bigger is better. Less fragmentation is better. And as you start to encroach on that, you start realizing impacts related to low breeding success, parasitism, which is there are other species that will actually lay. It's complicated. I won't go too much into detail, but there are nest parasites, cowbirds, for example, that they'll actually lay their eggs in the nests of some of these other species and allow the other species to brood and fledge their birds. So those types of species, good cowbirds, for example, only come as you have edge. So the closer the edge of fragmentation, the more likely you're going to have those, the more likely you'll have predators, generalist predators like foxes, weasels, skunk. So the greater the core area, the greater the forest interior, without having any fragmentation, the less likely of those other ancillary impacts.
Which are negative impacts.
Negative impacts.
Right. Now, it says some of, and I'm still on that quote in the first block, some found nowhere else in the state. So why is it that some of that these are found, the ones that we're referring to here, only in this area of the state? Do we know?
Because of the continuity of those forested habitats. In our state, we're largely urbanized, and the reason why DEM, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society have placed so much emphasis on the Western Bloc or the borderlands is that really it represents a larger contiguous, not necessarily forested, but contiguous habitat, uninfluenced by urbanization to the extent possible in southern New England. So as encroachment continues to occur, you continue to realize a homogenization of species in Rhode Island. So, there's a plethora of small properties, small lawns with American robins on them. Species like that the applicant has noted here, black-throated blue warblers, for example, you don't find those in backyards. These are species that are associated with these large contiguous, in this case, forested habitats.
So jumping down to the third paragraph in the quote, the first sentence says, particularly within this focus area, preventing fragmentation is of crucial importance to perpetuating the native biological communities. That's basically what you've been just explaining, correct?
That's correct.
Could we go to the next page, please, page 11? And the first full paragraph talks about shortly after publication of DEM's land acquisition plan, the Rhode Island Resource Protection Project, RIRPP, drafted a habitat resources map. The R, and then it goes down in the middle of the paragraph and it says the RIRPP identified this area as, quote, a significant non-urbanized area in the Washington, D.C. to Boston corridor. Are you familiar with the RIRPP?
I'm familiar. I wasn't directly involved in it. I know what it cites, but that was basically the extent of my knowledge of it. But the statement that you read at the end is significant, and I'll probably just expand on that. When Mr. Cummings was here from the Nature Conservancy, I heard his testimony, and he also noted that this is in the conservation community. This area within southern New England is well recognized for that reason as being a significant non-urbanized area. The most significant from Boston to Washington, D.C. If you look at a satellite image of overview of New England, the Chesapeake, you'll notice this is the largest, most contiguous, unfragmented, unurbanized area between that region, in that region. As a result, we have species that aren't found in other areas of southern New England because of that lack of encroachment from urbanization.
Let's look at the next paragraph. It starts out, it says, this area is no less a priority. It says then, but I think it should say than. It was 2 decades prior. In 2010, DEM identified this area within the state's priority forests as a future land conservation priority area. The Conservation Opportunity Area, COA mapping, then skipping down to the end, identifies a major wildlife corridor associated with Iron Mine Brook and its palustrine forested wetlands, traversing the portion of the state in which the majority of clearing and wetland impacts for the facility are proposed. Do you see that?
Yes.
So let's talk about these things a little bit. What is going back to the first sentence of this paragraph, what is a priority forest?
In the context of this document, the priority forests are unique forests. In this context, they're large contiguous areas. It could be forested, forests that have unique or more unique species in them. But in this context, it's related to core areas. So as you'll see in the next sentence, intact forests greater than 500 acres. They're easily mappable. In our documents, we typically go through a process of identifying important habitats, and that's one of the key criteria. In our state, there aren't many large forests left. And as a result, they become high priority because of their unique ability to provide habitat for species that aren't able to meet their needs in other parts of the state.
All right, and what is a land conservation priority area?
Land, actually,
It's in the second line.
I see it, yeah. To be honest, I don't recall the definition for that.
All right.
Sorry.
Isn't that a typo?
It should maybe say concentration?
It should be conservation.
Conservation.
A land conservation, yeah, that makes me feel better. I'm like, I don't remember ever seeing this. All right, a land conservation priority. Yeah. Not involved in everything, that's for sure. So it could be something. Anyway, I'll speak on land conservation priority area. Land conservation priority areas are areas within our state that we deem highly valuable for future conservation. So our agency does a fair amount of conservation acquisition through fee easement or whatnot. So we are, as part of our mission, really trying to protect species as a whole. and biodiversity as a whole, and have a land acquisition program as with part of their mission to do that for wildlife, protect species. So land conservation areas are mapped areas where we are targeting protection of lands. So this western block is high priority for us.
And as we said down at the bottom, it says that this particular COA map identifies a major wildlife corridor associated with Iron Mine Brook within a portion of the site that's going to be cleared for this project, correct?
That's correct.
Now, how do they go about identifying that this is in fact a major wildlife corridor?
Identifying wildlife corridors is an exact science, but the criteria used are habitat associated with it, continuity of the habitat associated with it, species identified within that habitat. So those are some of the ways that you identify these wildlife corridors, excuse me. In this case, all of those criteria are taken into account to designate an area. Within that said, within that context, the sideboards of those corridors are not exact sideboards. So corridors can be narrow or larger, and there can be some give and take in between those.
But you've reviewed this particular wildlife corridor, and are you confident that this proposed site is within that wildlife corridor?
Yes.
Now, going to page 12 at the top, the first sentence says, corridors allow migration between adjacent cores, large parcels of undeveloped habitat, which you've already defined for us. The applicant indicates that, quote, access to the proposed plant location by medium and large mammals would be prohibited due to the required securing fencing, end quote. Why is that a problem? Is that a problem?
There's a problem.
And why is that a problem?
Basically, it's an obstruction and a barrier in which, in this case, we noted large to medium mammals would not be able to penetrate and would have to circumnavigate to continue their migration to and from where they're going. So fencing from a wildlife perspective in this context, particularly medium to large mammals, is not conducive to allowing movement and flow.
Now, going down to the next paragraph on page 12, starting in the middle, it says, based on these analyses, more reasonable conclusions are that substantial forest clearing and fragmentation from the project will negatively impact area-sensitive wildlife and plants in the site vicinity, and that, at a broader spatial scale, this project will inhibit DEM's attempts to enhance landscape resiliency, to mitigate the loss of biodiversity through habitat fragmentation and climate change. You still agree with that?
Yes.
Could you help me understand some of these concepts?
Sure. So, in general, as I stated previously, increased fragmentation negatively impacts forested areas or core areas in this example. So as you continue to encroach, you bring some of the things that I listed before as negative impacts. You also bring invasive species, in lighting, which can impact plants. It can also impact temperature of an area. This area was noted in that 96 land plan as being unique because of the microclimates, the cooler microclimates in this area, allowing for a different type of habitat. So as you start clearing those areas and clearing the canopy, some of these other impacts start to surface.
The canopy you're referring to, this is basically
The forest canopy will keep a cooler climate, so as you clear that, this is particularly relevant with streams. So Iron Mine Brook, for example, when you clear the forested canopy, Naturally, you let more sunlight in. More sunlight means raising temperatures. From a stream system perspective, that can negatively impact the composition of the community within that stream. As the temperatures are raised, you'll lose certain species. Brook trouts, in one easy example to know.
Because they like cold
They
water.
like colder waters.
Could we go to page 18, please? Yes. go ahead.
Before you move on, just from that section on the value of forests in the northwest corner, I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Osenkowski, you said you were here for Scott Cummings' testimony.
Yes.
When you described connectivity, it was a different description than the sort of circuit tree flow model that the Nature Conservancy used and the ESS actually referenced as well. Are you familiar with that? Is that additive? Can you just comment? When Mr. Cummings was talking about the pinch point, he was taking this model that the Nature Conservancy developed and looking at circuitry, almost like an electric circuit, but looking at circuitry and flow. Is that different from the way you're looking at it?
No, it's not different. The work that the Nature Conservancy has done is completely relevant and overlaps with what I'm describing, just in a different way. It's still looking at energy flow within a system of biological communities. When I was answering the question of connectivity, I was thinking strictly from a wildlife perspective of movement of species. There's definitely overlap, and they're virtually, one is the same as the other. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, yeah, I was just, in terms of his testimony, yeah, I was just trying to understand how it jibed or overlapped or conflicted or augmented what you were talking about.
So, to try to tie them in, so the flow from my perspective of what I was trying to describe has to do with the movement of species between areas. Connectivity, with regard to what I believe Mr. Cummings was described, is not limited to wildlife species per se. It's really the movement of biological flow through, including flora and fauna. That's not necessarily what I was describing when I answered your question. And so it's more comprehensive in how it describes connectivity and flow.
And how does, from your DEM perspective, the work that the Nature Conservancy does affect your conclusions or your conservation goals?
We work very closely with the Nature Conservancy, and we have many overlapping goals, and particularly as it relates to the importance of habitats within the state and land acquisition priorities within the state. We are very, very closely aligned and work with them continually, fluidly. So I would say that our goals and ambitions are in part directly in line with the Nature Conservancy's in our state for conservation.
Do you know if anyone's ever approached Spectra and tried to acquire this property?
DEM did in 2009. Our land acquisition committee reached out to them, and at that time, I don't believe we received any interest back. I actually have a document here, an email from that. But I know that in 2009 we did reach out to them to seek whether or not they would be interested in sale of the property for land acquisition for conservation. I can find that.
Sure, if you have it, that would be great.
Well, I'll
Maybe at the
I'll
break.
come across it at the break, yeah.
Yeah, we'll have a break, I'm sure, and
Actually, I just found it. So, DEM staff met with Algonquin in 2009 to discuss the potential sale for land conservation easement. Algonquin did not pursue it beyond the initial meeting and some preliminary discussions.
all right, thank you.
Could I just ask a question to follow up on Director Coy? So, When you first started talking about connectivity, and then the Nature Conservancy modeling was brought up, would you say that those are just different ways of describing the characteristics of particular habitats? I think you characterized the Nature Conservancy's model as being even more inclusive.
I would say that the way they describe it is definitely more inclusive, and it's talking more about energy within a system, which is similar. But when in my first description, I was not limiting it. I was limiting it to species movement, not necessarily the energy of flow within a system.
Just wildlife species?
My initial definition was focused towards wildlife, that's correct, yes.
Thank you.
Following up on that, do you agree that both wildlife as well as flora and those things are also impacted by these corridors and this flow?
I do believe that. I mean, my description was narrow in that I was focusing on wildlife, but the intent of it is expanded. It expands to the flow of all biological organisms within that system.
And you said you heard Mr. Cummings' testimony, correct?
Yeah, I was here for his comment.
Did you agree with his testimony?
I did agree. I thought he did a very good job, to be honest. Now, it was probably a month ago, so I only vaguely remember parts of it, but I did take notes.
Was there anything in there in which you said, no, I disagree with that?
No. Scott's pretty bright.
Could we look at page 18, please? So this topic is impacts on the habitat from invasive species. And you're comfortable talking about this subject?
Yes.
And so the first sentence says, invasive species are one of the most ubiquitous and severe threats to wildlife and their habitats. Could you just explain why?
Invasive species, it's really related to their pervasiveness and their ability to adapt when there is disturbance in particular, and then displace native species. That would be the simple, most direct answer I could give. Invasive species are a very large problem throughout the nation, but Rhode Island is no different. And a lot of times invasive species, the way they colonize is when there's a disturbance. So in the context of this project, when you create a forest clearing, you create an opportunity for species to colonize. Invasive species get their name because they're so apt to be able to colonize prior to other species, and then once they really take over, they prevent other species from persisting. So it is a significant threat to habitat and fish and wildlife within the state.
Down at the bottom of that paragraph it says, DEM concurs with the applicant's assertion below, and then it quotes from the application filed by Invenergy in this matter, which says, the creation of new forest edges will result in greater light penetration to these areas, and in turn will promote the growth of sun-tolerant, early successional plant species, and inhibit the growth of shade-tolerant forest interior species. The disturbance and creation of new forest edges associated with this work has the potential to promote the growth of invasive plant species, and then it has some examples. These non-native species often outcompete native plants, which decreases the quality of wildlife habitat compared to areas free of invasive species. And you agree with that statement by the applicant in this matter?
Yes, I do.
That's basically an example, a more technical explanation of what you just stated, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it provides examples of species that are of concern within our state, where they can take over and inhibit native species growth and then displace wildlife as a result.
Goes on to say, the DEM opinion does further, the combined longevity and motility of many invasive plant seeds makes it likely that tree clearing and soil disturbance would promote the growth of invasive plants on site, even if there does not appear to be an obvious seed source in the immediate vicinity. Could you explain how that's possible?
Many invasive species are incredibly capable of travel through pollination, seed movement on other organisms, wind. They get listed as invasive species because of their aggressiveness to be able to take over a site, and part of that is their mobility to get to a site, and it has to do a lot with human movement. So when a project, not necessarily just this project, but a project is occurring, you have vehicle traffic going in and out of the project, coming from areas that have invasive seeds or invasive species, and so they start bringing these materials in. It can be through wind, it could be through animals, but it's largely, a lot of times, it's through us. It's inadvertent, but those are how plants move.
What particular risks, if any, does removing soil from one part of the site and then stockpiling it on another site, and then maybe reusing that stockpile of soil, how does that play into the invasive species?
Well, if you're removing soil and moving it to a new area, then you're potentially providing access for any other species in that given area to then get in the soil and be transplanted back to the site. And just the removal of soil in and of itself is now basically, try to describe it, in a way we can understand, giving you a clean slate. So you have vegetation there that have a stronghold, and maybe as long as they persist there, invasive species can't penetrate. But as soon as you take that area and you clear the slate, now you're basically giving everyone equal opportunity to try to colonize. And the invasive species, like the term suggests, are most likely the most aggressive to be able to colonize a site. Coupled with now you're bringing soil back where they could have been contaminated by invasive species. And contaminated, I mean plant material on that soil. So it's very common, urbanized areas are tend to have high number of invasive species within them. So a lot of construction companies, based out of Warwick or wherever they're based out of, are in contact with a lot of those species. Whereas in this area, there's probably very little seed bank within the given area. There's probably no seed bank, I should say, within the given area, but there is also not a significant source within that area. So really the worst thing you can do is, for an invasive species having a good opportunity to colonize, is clear an area, clear the soil, and then say, have at it, whoever's first wins.
And your understanding of the proposal for this site is that there will be a substantial amount of clearing required, correct?
That's correct.
The laydown areas will be substantially cleared, correct? The access road that's being proposed,
Yep.
The area for the construction of the power block.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right, let's look at page 19 if we can. 2/3 of the way down, the site inventory and biological survey, that was kicked over to you. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yes.
I'd like to start with the second paragraph. It says, the applicant states that one state threatened, parens, black-throated blue warbler, parens, and several areas sensitive, parens, Canada warbler, northern water thrush, eastern box turtle, etc. species were found in on-site habitats and its sites to the Invasive application. All of the migratory birds listed above and several others were listed by the applicant as probable breeders on the site. Do you see that?
Yes.
Let's talk for a little bit. Just I know we've had some discussion about this before, but I don't think anybody's ever sat down to just bring it down to basics. On a basic level, what does it mean for a bird to be state threatened?
So there's several designations. You're probably all familiar with hearing the word endangered species. So endangered from a federal perspective typically will mean in danger of extinction. Trying not to use the definition in the way. From a state perspective, a state endangered species typically is subject to potential extirpation. And that may receive listing because it's already federally endangered, or it may be vulnerable within the state because there's only a few populations remaining. Threatened is basically another notch down from that, where there's concern that it's likely it will be raised to the listing of endangered, which then could end with extirpation from an area. So that's what state threatened would imply, is that at this point they're vulnerable. There's a likelihood that they become listed as endangered, and could be for a variety of reasons. But
Is part of the reason that it was classified as state threatened the black-throated blue warbler because it doesn't appear in many areas in the state?
That's correct. Yeah, very good.
And what about area-sensitive species, such as the eastern box turtle, etc.? What does that mean?
Area sensitive would imply that they need large contiguous areas. So of whatever fulfills their habitat needs. But fragmented areas with smaller blocks would be detrimental to their persistence.
And at the top of the next page, it talks about these birds and others being listed as probable breeders on the site. Why is it important to know that?
It's hard to describe, to talk about these birds without showing you guys pictures. I wish I had pictures. Anyway, probable breeders. Why is that important? Because breeding really is what persists a population. So areas are raised in importance when there's a likelihood that species are breeding on that property. Because obviously, as you know, breeding allows for populations to persist. So if they are just present, not breeding, then the value of habitats isn't necessarily as high.
So the fact that they're probable breeders on this site makes this site even more important. Is that fair to say?
For the perspective from those individual species, that's correct, yeah.
Okay. Now, about 2/3 of the way down in that top paragraph on page 20, it starts, a complete biological inventory. Do you see that?
Yes.
Would need to be done in all on-site habitats over several seasons and ideally over several years to provide a reasonable picture of what species utilize which portions of the site and for what portion of their life cycle. You agree with that?
I agree with that.
And there was not a biological inventory that was conducted over several seasons or over several years, correct?
No, there was not.
All right. And why do you say that? I mean, why is it important to look over several seasons and ideally over several years?
There's a few reasons for that, particularly because of temporal influences over time. So you may not detect the species simply because of the climatic conditions for that year or because of the dispersal that year. You really need to have multi-year monitoring to be confident that you're fully detecting species on a site. And then you need to cover an entire annual cycle within that. If you're trying to be inclusive of all species, they all have different requirements and different occurrences within our state at different times. So you really need to be inclusive within a year and over many years. And then the last thing I state is that another reason for that is that the vast majority of species, or maybe not the vast majority, but a large number of species are very cryptic and very difficult to monitor and almost impossible to monitor. So some species may only occur every other year. Their populations may not occur, they may not show themselves. They're just not. Birds are easier. I think a lot of people, and a lot of the monitoring focuses on birds because they're highly visual, they vocalize, and so they're easy to detect. There are some species that are just very cryptic and very difficult to detect.
What does that mean?
Cryptic would just mean secrecy, basically. This example probably isn't pertinent for this site, but we have a species of amphibian in the state, spadefoot toads. They only come out in severe rain events and only maybe every so many years. So if you do 1 year of a survey, you didn't necessarily hit the year that in the rain event where they show. So because of the criteria like that, there's so many species in our state and they all have different attributes to them. You really have to have a fully encompassing survey if you want to be as comprehensive as possible.
Well, why is it important to have as comprehensive an inventory as possible?
Well, it's important if you want to try to conserve all species on the site, or at least try to mitigate and or avoid impacts to species. If you're not aware of all the species, you can't really plan for how to mitigate for impacts.
The last sentence of that paragraph says, it is unclear how many more state-listed species or species of greatest conservation need, SGCN, a dedicated survey might uncover. And that's the point you've been making, correct?
That's correct.
Could you tell us, please, what is a species of greatest conservation need?
Yes. So species, I know there's a lot of acronyms here. There's a lot of different listings, but species of greatest conservation need is a relatively new one that came forth in 2004, and that definition came out of a federal appropriations initiative to provide funding for species that weren't already receiving funding. So species of greatest conservation need typically may imply vulnerable species, endangered species, but it can, or species of concern where their populations aren't in danger yet, but there is reason to believe that there's a concern. They could be limited by habitat type within our state, so then they would elevate to species of conservation concern. They could be area sensitive species, so then they would elevate to conservation concern within our state. But they could also be keystone species, which are species that through their actions provide habitat needs for other species. So the easy one to describe would be beaver. So beavers impound rivers, create ponds, and as a result they provide a suite of habitat needs for other species. So that's basically most of the criteria for species of greatest conservation need. So it doesn't necessarily imply only rare species, is my point.
Okay. And the next paragraph states that the applicant asserts that migration barriers from habitat fragmentation, quote, may be especially significant for reptiles and amphibians, which, unlike birds or medium to large-bodied mammals, face serious barriers to movement from even minor human-caused changes in the landscape, such as roads, retaining walls, fences, etc., end quote, inciting to the Invasive application. All of these elements are proposed as part of the project. And you agree with that?
I agree with that. They're just, our point in that is just to highlight that. I mean, a lot of the discussion revolves around birds, but birds are actually one of the most highly mobile species we have. And so when you're talking about turtles in particular, or amphibians, you know, their movements are much more restricted, and impacts with retaining walls and fencing and roads in particular create high mortality for these species, can have detrimental impacts there.
Could we look at page 22? The heading says summary and conclusion. And I'd like to look at the third paragraph. It says DEM does not believe there is sufficient evidence in the application to support the statement that, quote, The project has already been designed to minimize impacts to forested habitat areas, end quote, citing to data responses. Do you stand by that?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
I don't believe that the inventory and the monitoring done for this site is fully comprehensive. So it's hard to answer and reply to whether or not we've minimized impacts for all species when I'm not convinced that all species have been identified.
And you feel that way even after, let me back up. The original advisory opinion that we're looking at was done before the 2017 inventory that was done by ESS, correct?
That's correct.
But the opinion that I just asked you, if you stand by that, you've seen the 2017 inventory,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
And you still feel that way?
Yes.
Let's move down to the bottom of the page, 3 lines up from the bottom. It says, the majority of the ecological impacts from the facility will occur in upland areas outside the scope of the wetlands permit and outside the jurisdiction of DEM's Office of Water Resources, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Further, going to the top of page 23, since the majority of impacts relate to permanent loss of interior forest, they would be exceedingly difficult to mitigate despite a good faith effort to do so. Do you still agree with that?
Yes. I think you can't mitigate, in my opinion, you can't fully mitigate impacts of losing this contiguous forested area. I mean, you lost it. You can try to lessen, you're mitigating in that you're trying to maybe lessen the impacts that are occurring, but the impacts are the impacts. The biggest impact is that you cleared and encroached on this contiguous forest. Unless you're not going to do that, then the impacts are still persist.
Going down to the second full paragraph right in the middle, it says further fragmentation of one of the largest remaining intact forests in the state will negatively impact area fish and wildlife, including interior forest specialists listed as species of greatest conservation need in the state's wildlife action plan. And I think we've already discussed those concepts, haven't we?
Yes.
And you stand by that?
Yes.
The next paragraph in the 3rd line, the proposed facility would bring additional stressors to area wildlife, state listed or otherwise. And could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, but I lost you. Can you just repeat where you are?
Yeah, if you're on page 23,
Yep.
the second paragraph up from the bottom,
Okay.
it begins in the 3rd line in that paragraph. The proposed facility would bring additional stressors to area wildlife, state listed or otherwise.
Okay.
What are your concerns there?
So as I mentioned previously and testified to previously, we know noise and light pollution, changes in air and water quality. So I sort of implied all those about maybe 20 minutes ago. So with this project and with any type of project, similar project, some of the disturbances that you end up realizing are increased noise pollution, which I testified on why those create negative impacts for wildlife. Light pollution, and as I previously mentioned, air and water quality because of temperature changes, or lighting requirements. You get different plant communities because of shade-tolerant species versus sun-tolerant species. So those are all the types of impacts that you bring forward with a project like this. All of those have typically negative impacts to species that are already persist on a site. Such as this. They persist on a site like this because they don't have those criteria. There isn't significant noise to create whatever negative impacts, poor breeding production, or light pollution to deter moth species, or warm temperatures to prevent cooler climate species from persisting. So with a clearing project, you then invite all, and then potentially industrial or commercial or even residential type of project coming in, you invite all these negative stressors to fish and wildlife and habitat.
The final paragraph on page 23, starting with the second line, it says Rhode Island has prioritized and invested in this area for wildlife conservation for decades. The location of a facility of this size and scope, immediately adjacent to substantial acreage of state holdings of conservation land, is not consistent with the conservation priorities that informed these state conservation plans. Do you still agree with that?
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit more? Why do you feel it's not consistent?
Our land acquisition efforts, particularly within the Division of Fish and Wildlife, are focused in this context of this property in this area, are focused at creating larger, more contiguous areas. So really the last thing we want to see is encroachment of any type of development, power plant or subdivision. And this is, again, it's encroachment. And within core areas that I described before, the configuration of core areas is important. It's not necessarily good enough just to have a long linear block of forest with lots of edge along that linear. You could have a 500-acre linear block of forest. It's really the interior core that is most valuable. So the further away from the edge that you are, the more valuable the habitat. So our goal is usually to try to create and prevent encroachment of that edge. So that's
good. Can we look at page 34, please? I think the things I wanted to discuss on page 34 and 35 are things that you've already discussed in detail, so I think I'll just skip over that. Could we look at page 37? And I think the same is true for page 37. I think you've already fully discussed those issues. So let's look at the supplemental advisory opinion. Page 4, please. At the very bottom. The final sentence says, while the EFSB requested supplemental opinions based on the availability of additional information, little of what has been made available subsequent to DEM's advisory opinion allows, top of page 5, for a more detailed discussion on the nature of fish and wildlife impacts or influences DEM's original conclusions regarding the site of the proposed facility. Do you see that?
yes.
And what you're referring there, I assume, is discussed in the next couple of paragraphs regarding the 2017 inventory that was done by ESS, correct?
Yes.
And why is it that you concluded that this really didn't help you much?
Well, again, I think it's not inclusive of what I believe are probably all species on the site, and so it's hard to measure all the impacts without knowing, really having a comprehensive assessment of the site. And I'm not saying, I just kind of want to clarify, I'm not necessarily saying the applicant did a poor job. I think from what they did do for surveys, they did a good job. It's just not comprehensive to be able to fully describe and evaluate impacts.
Were you here for the testimony, Mr. Zemba?
No.
No. Okay.
Could you just clarify that earlier when we were talking about the first advisory opinion, that was before this
Yeah.
report, and now this supplemental is subsequent to this biological inventory. And so your comments earlier were before you saw that, and you talked about seasonality and other aspects. What is it about this biological inventory report that you feel is not comprehensive?
The time frame of the surveys, the type of surveys conducted. In time frame, I mean both within a season or within a year, but also the unfortunately the fact that it's not multi-year across time, a time scale, and so those two. But then the survey types are not necessarily comprehensive of all species that can be detected within a given area. Like I said a moment ago, I think they did a good job with their survey techniques for many species were what we would advise and are consistent with literature. So I think they did an adequate job on what the species they were trying to detect, but it's not inclusive of all species, and it wasn't across a time scale.
So what are the species or the techniques that you feel were lacking?
Well, I would go based on time. I'd have to bring up their report to go back through their techniques. I recall many of them: point count surveys, pitfall traps, and whatnot, but I really have to have a listing. But the largest is that it's the time scale. Some of the surveys may have started just after the peak survey time for detecting a species. And so that may be the reason why a species wasn't detected. It may just be that it was only that 1 year, and that although it did cover the peak time, it wasn't multi-year. And so, I mean, we have this on our long-term monitoring. We have many long-term monitoring programs at the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and it is quite common that you don't detect a certain species every year, even though it's utilizing that site. That just comes with the nature of monitoring. You're not out there 24/7. You're not necessarily using the best technique to identify the species' presence or absence. And that's why I feel like it's critically important to have a longer time frame of monitoring.
Is it possible that some of the species that were missed were in fact as high listed as endangered species?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I asked if it was possible that some of the species that were missed due to the inadequacies that he just identified could have been endangered.
No, I think that's well within his expert scope.
I would say, yeah. I mean, obviously, if they're endangered, they're rare. So by that alone, you have a less likelihood of detection. So being more thorough for those species, whether or not those species are on this site, I'm not going to say one way or the other, I don't know. But it's reasonable to believe that rare species would potentially be less likely to be detected, just purely based on abundance.
And they'd be more likely to be detected if you extended the time frame, correct?
Yes.
So staying on page 5, the opinion summarizes the ESS work that was done in 2017, and there's a quote here. It says, the report found 13 distinct field survey programs were completed as part of this inventory, which resulted in the detection of 520 animal and plant species in the study area, including 113 vertebrates, 81 birds, 21 mammals, 8 amphibians, and 3 reptiles, 220 invertebrates, 147 butterflies and moths, 25 dragonflies and damselflies, and 48 other invertebrates, and 187 plants, 17 state-listed species, including 1 state endangered species, 4 state threatened species, 10 species of concern, and 2 protected species, as well as 47 species of greatest conservation need, SGCN, citing a RIDEM Nature Conservancy report in 2015, were detected in the study area during the course of this inventory. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Now, previously I asked you about Mr. Zemba, but Mr. Zemba described this in his words as some of the most biologically diverse and valuable property in the state. And in 30 years of working as an ecologist, I've never had a site where we've had 17 listed species and 48 species of greatest conservation need. That was remarkable to me. Do you agree with what Mr. Zemba said?
I would say that it's highly valuable for fish and wildlife as far as conservation of high priority species.
It goes on to state on page 5 in the middle that 2 state-threatened birds, the black-throated blue warbler and the black-burnian warbler, were reported as probable breeders on site, and that both of these are forest interior species, and we've discussed the importance of them breeding on site, correct?
Yes.
The very last line on page 5 says, while the above results of the survey efforts are certainly helpful and further support the conclusion, going to the top of page 6, that the forest interior habitat provided on site is quite valuable, it should be noted that a single season of survey is unlikely to reveal the full suite of biodiversity on site. As stated in the department's original advisory opinion, a complete biological inventory would need to be done in all on-site habitats over several seasons and ideally over several years to provide a reasonable picture of what species utilize which portions of the site and for what portions of the life cycle. And this is exactly what you just explained to Director Coit, correct?
That's correct.
It goes on to say, as is evidenced by the small number of reptiles and amphibians uncovered, the most cryptic species can easily go undetected during the course of a single study. As such, this list should by no means be considered exhaustive of the potential species on site, state listed or otherwise. Do you stand by that conclusion?
Yes.
Could we look at page 8, please, at the very bottom? Now, to put it in context, I think we need to flip back to page 7. And you'll see that the heading in the middle of page 7 is the Boreal Interconnection Project. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you know what that is, correct?
Yes.
That's the transmission line that will connect the plant to the substation.
That's correct, yes.
So in the context of that, at the bottom of page 8, it says, in addition to 2 vernal pools within the footprint of the proposed creek, both of which were found to have wood frog and spotted salamander egg masses in the spring. The applicant, to the top of page 9, indicated that there are additional 3 vernal pools out of a total of 14 depicted on plan sheets, quote, that are within approximately 40 feet of proposed construction activities on the TNEC ROW right-of-way. The other 11 vernal pools are not close to proposed tree clearing or construction activities, citing a response to DEM. I'd like to ask you a few questions about this statement. Could you tell us, we've had some discussion from Mr. Zember about what a vernal pool is, but could you tell us your understanding of what a vernal pool is and why it's important?
Vernal pools are basically seasonal water bodies. Typically they dry out, so unlike a pond, vernal pool means that the water's there temporarily. The reason why they're so critically important for species conservation, there's a lot of other biological benefits to vernal pools, but from a species conservation perspective, there are species that are dependent and obligated to only use vernal pools for breeding. So, for example, you noted in there spotted salamanders and wood frogs. Those are core basic vernal pool species that require fishless ponds. In most of the Northeast, at least, anywhere that there's permanent water, people feel the need to put fish in it. Fish are fish are predators for many species, and some of which cannot persist with fish in a pond. So wood frogs and spotted salamanders are indicative of vernal pools because they are not able to persist and lay eggs in, or at least produce larvae in ponds that are permanent. So they require these temporary ponds. They're seasonally flooded, usually in the spring, sometimes in the fall.
And the advisory opinion pointed out that 2 of these vernal pools were found to have wood frog and spotted salamander egg masses in the spring. And that was important for the reason you just discussed, because it shows that they're in fact operating the way they were intended to operate, correct?
Yes, yeah. And the idea of having vernal pools in close proximity to each other is also important. Many of these populations work in these meta-population kind of dynamics where there are smaller populations that make up a larger regional population. But because of the hydrological regimes in that vernal pools, some years maybe one will have water, the next year maybe it won't have water, but the one 50 feet from it will have water. It's really important to have that sort of matrix of vernal pools within a system so that these animals have a place to breed every year. It's common to have vernal pools maybe dry in one year and not in another, depending on whatever the hydrology is within the given area. And many of these species, going back to wood frogs and spotted salamanders, they're primarily, they're targeted at and most notably tied to vernal pools because they cannot persist and breed without vernal pools, but they spend most of their year in the upland. And they move up to 1,000 feet, from these ponds. So having that, again, going back to the core contiguous area, having that core contiguous undisturbed habitat surrounding it is important to probably 90% of their other part of their life cycle.
We're on page 9 and we're at the top, and it says, after quoting from the applicant's data response, it is difficult to determine the exact distances of the 14 vernal pools in and along the right-of-way from the proposed limits of clearing and disturbance from simply reviewing the RIDEM and USACE permit drawings submitted by the applicant. However, based on those drawings, the depictions of these vernal pools seems to contradict the applicant's assertion, i.e., far more than 3 of them appear to be close enough to be impacted by tree clearing and other work. Additionally, while 40 feet may be a reasonable distance to assess direct impacts to individual pools, such as the loss of shade, it cannot be assumed to cover all impacts to species that use these pools, such as the forest-dwelling wood frogs and spotted salamanders. And do you stand by that?
Yes.
All right, I'd like to talk about these 2 issues separately. So let's talk about the claim that only 3 of these vernal pools are close enough to be directly impacted by the tree clearing or construction activities. Why do you feel that your review of these contradicts that?
Well, it's like the reason I just described, actually. The impacts of land clearing persist beyond the edge of where the last tree was cleared. Sun, noise, invasive species all penetrate X distance within the forested habitat. So to evaluate a project and evaluate it just simply at its limit of disturbance, which is basically the edge of the clearing, is flawed because from a fish and wildlife or biological perspective, because those impacts penetrate within the forested habitat beyond the clearing edge. And as I described recently, just a minute ago, as far as needs for some of these species, the needs of these species to persist extends well beyond the edge of the vernal pool. 1,000 feet, 300 meters, and that's not taking into account dispersal distances for young juvenile, animals.
So is your belief that more than 3 of the vernal pools on the right-of-way will be adversely impacted by the construction?
Yes.
We look at page 10, please. Now, to get a sense of what we're talking about, you'll see the heading near the top says wetland impacts and the wetland review process. You see that?
Yes.
Going over to page 11, in the second paragraph, in the middle, it says the permitting processes to which the applicant would have EFSB defer do not address forest loss and fragmentation, any loss of upland habitat, nor impacts to state-listed or otherwise at-risk species outside of wetlands. As such, it is erroneous to assume that such impacts to wildlife habitat should not be addressed except through DEM's freshwater wetland application and the Federal Clean Water Act review. Could you explain that? Why is that the case?
Rhode Island has fairly strong wetland regulations. They do a fairly good job of protecting the wetland itself. In the context of what I believe my role is, and from the Division of Fish and Wildlife, thinking of large landscape scale habitats and needs of fish and wildlife within those habitats, wetland regs alone sort of force you in the wetland permitting, I don't know if I should, Chuck Corbett already testified?
He did.
Okay. So I'm not going to go too much into wetland regs. I did work in there for 5 years, but the wetland regs force you to put blinders on, and you stay within the context of the black and white regulations. And some of those blinders are that you are not allowed to or able to review impacts beyond the jurisdictional wetland. And the impacts that I'm concerned with in here in this portion extend beyond the wetland edge. So again, going back to species needs, many species need vernal pools for a portion or a segment of their life history. But they're, going back to wood frogs, spotted salamanders, they're spending the majority of their life is spent outside of that jurisdictional wetland. So simply protecting the wetland itself is not going to protect the species. This is the point.
There's been a lot of discussion, especially when Mr. Horvath was here, of the avoid, minimize, mitigate mantra. You're familiar with that. Would you agree with me, based on your experience, that under the wetlands regulations, the applicant is required to demonstrate to DEM that all probable impacts to freshwater wetlands have been avoided to the maximum extent possible?
That is the concept.
If it turns out that avoidance is not possible, then the applicant has the burden of satisfactorily demonstrating in writing that there are no alternatives to the proposed alterations which would not alter the natural character of any freshwater wetlands. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Osenkowski, you'd agree with me that if DEM determines that Invasive's proposed project does not comply with the impact avoidance and minimization requirements in the freshwater wetlands rules, that the department has the authority to deny approval for the project?
That's correct.
Could we go back to page 11, please? And we're on the supplemental DEM advisory opinion. Looking at the final paragraph. It says, even if there was an established regulatory process by which DEM could address such impacts, by the way, to get our mind back where we are, we're talking about impacts outside of the wetlands, correct?
Okay. Yeah.
Even if there was an established regulatory process by which DEM could address such impacts, their mitigation might not be possible. The Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan identifies habitat fragmentation as one of the foremost threats to Rhode Island's biodiversity, including state-listed plants and animals and other species of greatest conservation need. Given the weight of this threat in an already fragmented landscape, the best course of action is to avoid further fragmentation to the greatest extent practicable, to focus conservation on the best and least impaired blocks of habitat, to focus restoration efforts on restoring connectivity of intact habitats, rather than to continue to fragment landscapes and look for mitigation elsewhere. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah.
Could you expand on the explanation of why mitigating these types of impacts outside of wetlands might not be possible at all?
Going back to what I described earlier, this is consistent with what I said related to fragmentation. It's difficult when you consider that fragmentation's a high priority threat, one of the highest priority threats. Once you fragment that landscape, you can't really mitigate for that fragmentation, or you can only do so much. You can't really mitigate for that fragmentation. The disturbance of the fragmentation is what we're concerned with. All the examples I provided as it relates to fragmentation and all those negative factors that come with fragmentation. Trying to roll it up for you. The fragmentation is the greatest concern. I mean, ways that you can attempt to mitigate would be invasive species, but things like noise, lighting, you can only do so much. The impact's there. You can mitigate it, you can lessen it. It may not be sufficient to allow populations to persist. With regards to wetlands, an example would be, all right, you put a road in across the stream. So you have this project, you're crossing a stream. You can go through the stream with the road and bisect the stream, or you could mitigate by putting a culvert in. That's one way to mitigate. A culvert may not allow for the movement of species, given the elevation of it or size of it. So another way to mitigate may be to put a bridge. That would be the more extreme level, a bridge to another level of mitigation. So yeah, you've mitigated, but the disturbance is still there. The barrier is still there. The constriction point now that you're funneling things through is now there. So that opens up other factors that you didn't maybe foresee in the initial mitigation plan. Now you're creating a funneling effect, where species and predators of those species have an area that they can concentrate. So the best route to go is avoidance. With regard to fragmentation, you really can't, once you fragment it, that's the issue. I mean, that's the concern, is the fragmentation. You can make measures, you can take measures to try to lessen that impact, but the impact's the impact. What we're concerned with is fragmentation. What we're concerned with is maintaining large core areas. As you continue to encroach, you're bringing in all those negative factors that I described before.
Would you agree with me that the best way to avoid these negative impacts is to not build the plant in this location?
That's maybe not necessarily the plant itself, but in general, when we're talking about a core area, yeah, that's the point. That's why we're so aggressive in our land acquisition efforts to try to build core areas and build resiliency to those core areas to keep fragmentation out. So when you have other options to place developments or disturbances in general, you choose those other options over an area that's already very highly valuable because of the contiguous nature of it.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you very much, Mr. Osenkowski.
I follow up on that. That last paragraph talks about an already fragmented landscape.
Yes.
So how does that square with your description of the area as a core forest?
So in general, wait, I'm just going to reread it, sorry. Okay, so in southern New England, particularly in Rhode Island, we are already working in a very highly fragmented landscape. We have a very dense population, a high degree of urbanization, and in general, a great vast area within the state is consistent with how it's been managed and how it's been developed. So the borderlands, or the western bloc, is unique in that urbanization really hasn't hit that area as hard yet. And so what we're talking about here and what we're trying to protect is protect those core large contiguous habitats from fragmentation that you suffer from increased urbanization. So as I mentioned previously, with urbanization, the way our state is in its current state, in the way it's been developed, there's a great degree of homogenization along the coastline. Very urbanized, highly populated, similar habitats. The species associated in those areas have the same needs. They don't need large contiguous areas of habitat. So you have a plethora of certain species. What we don't have a lot of are large, contiguous, unfragmented areas without many houses or developments. And those are critically important in providing those habitat needs for species that do need these unfragmented, undisturbed areas. So the western part of the state is still the stronghold for that. But as time goes on, encroachment continues to be the greatest threat, really. I mean, there's a lot of threats, obviously, climate change and whatnot, but again, I'll go back to try not to use the human-induced, try not to use anthropogenic disturbances of humans. As we continue to encroach on these large contiguous areas, we're going to continue to see the decline of species that require those habitats. And we're going to see the increase of species that we see everywhere in Warwick and everywhere else. And I just point out, just to expand on that, and as a result, the biodiversity within the state will decrease, which is what we're trying to maintain, is high biodiversity. We want all the native species that persist here to be able to continue to persist in a sustainable way in perpetuity.
Good morning, Mr. Osenkowski.
Good morning.
My name is Elizabeth Noonan. I represent Invenergy in these proceedings. Welcome back. You mentioned your background. You had a bachelor's in environmental science and a master's in, I believe, is it conservation biology?
Yep.
But that was from URI?
I'm sorry, do you have a curriculum vitae?
I believe I submitted it. I don't have one with me, but I definitely have one, and I submitted it. It was. Go ahead.
I don't think that we have it on the record. I'd like to make a record request for this witnesses and for all of the other DEM witnesses. Could we get resumes or CVs?
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I've collected them all. I was told that we did need to submit them, but I can submit them all.
Thank you very much.
So while I don't have the benefit of your CV, let's go through this anyway. Your degrees were from University of Rhode Island, right?
Yes.
Okay, and when you worked at DEM, is it correct you spent 5 years in the freshwater wetlands area?
Approximately. It was 4 years, actually.
All right.
Wetland permitting.
And you worked with Mr. Horbert?
Yes.
You also indicated that you were on a municipal planning board for 15 years. Which community was that?
Copy. Since 2004 to present.
Good.
Sorry.
She can't type and sneeze. For which community?
Coventry,
And were you all, what years were those?
2004 to present, sadly. I really should get off, shouldn't I? Like, get a life.
Well, I don't think I've seen you, so I should get a life too, because I'm usually at those planning board meetings. But also, you said you were on the Conservation Commission. Was that for Coventry also?
Yes.
Okay. And you indicated that you were an environmental consultant. Who did you work for?
I worked for Scott Rabideau.
Natural Resource Services?
Natural Resource Services, yeah.
And are you familiar with Mr. Ringler to my right?
Yes.
And how are you familiar with him?
Briefly,
professionally.
We went to college together.
I said professionally.
He worked for Scott after I left. He took my job. So.
All right.
Yeah. He's a good guy.
Thank
I
you.
give him that.
Good. Did you see his testimony?
Yes,
All right, so did you watch all of his testimony?
the majority of it. And I read his pre-filed testimony.
And you also said you viewed Mr. Cummings' testimony?
I was here for all of that, yes. And read his pre-filed testimony.
How many times have you been out to the site?
Just once.
And when was that?
I want to say 2017. I don't know exactly. It was when Chris Reichel was not retired, and he's been retired over a year.
And what was the purpose of your visit?
Site inspection, just to get general knowledge, familiarize myself with the site, identify any species on the site that were present at the time that I was there.
Did you do any report or summary of that site visit?
No, I did not.
Were any of your... when you went out there, do you recall if it was after you had received ESS's biodiversity inventory?
I believe it was before.
But you had reviewed the application, which had some
Yes.
biodiversity. Let me finish my question,
Sorry.
and you can answer, because it makes her life difficult. You had reviewed the EFSB application, and that was the basis of your original advisory opinion, correct?
Yes.
When you went out on the site, did you find anything inconsistent with EFSB's application regarding biodiversity? Invenergy's application too?
No.
You last testified before this board on January 30th, 2019. You recall that?
Yes.
Since that time and up till today, what, if anything, have you done to prepare for your testimony?
Just reviewed the documentation that I thought that I would be questioned on.
All right. So would that include the pre-filed testimonies that you've already told us about?
Yes.
All right. Obviously, the DEM advisory opinions, correct?
Yes.
Did you look at the freshwater wetlands application at all?
No, I have not.
As part of the freshwater wetlands application for this project, which is application 170079, were you requested to have any input into that application?
Not that I recall.
And would that be fair to say that that's in your normal course of your business currently, you would not be opining on freshwater wetlands applications?
That's correct.
Did you review any of the other advisory opinions in this case?
Yes.
Can you tell me which ones?
Not non-DEM or within DEM?
Non-DEM, because we have two.
Okay, no. I was just, when you stated that, I thought about other divisions within DEM.
No, outside DEM. So I know earlier you testified about light and noise, but you didn't look at the Department of Health advisory.
No, I had not.
All right, and you haven't looked at any of the planning advisories from statewide planning?
No, I have not.
When you went out to the site in 2017, did you also observe the location of the Algonquin compressor station?
I observed it. I mean, we walked by it.
So you're aware that Algonquin Lane is a road that goes
Yes.
in?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. You're aware that Algonquin Lane is a road that goes into the compressor station, correct?
Yes.
And that the compressor station itself is a fenced entity?
Yes.
Okay. And that it's been there for over 50 years?
Yes.
And in fact, it is it's proximal to the proposed site, is it not?
That's correct.
So in this sense, the property of Spectra that DEM apparently was looking to acquire back in 2009 is a total of 730 acres, correct?
If you say so.
Subject to check. And the portion that we're proposing, Venergy is proposing, is 67 acres. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And of that, 30 is being proposed to be cleared.
Correct.
And then following that, restoration of the laydown area, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start first with the supplemental advisory opinion briefly on page 15. You can let me know when you're there. Okay. When Mr. Horbert was here last week, he talked about the areas of jurisdictional wetlands and the permitting process for jurisdictional wetlands. I am correct that you are not testifying on that area, correct?
That's correct.
And when we say jurisdictional wetlands, we understand that to be both the biological wetlands and then any upland area that would be encompassed within the buffer areas.
Yes.
Okay. So on page 15, you're familiar with this from the supplemental DEM advisory opinion, correct?
Yep.
Right. That first full paragraph, we've read through it numerous times. Let's do it one more time. It starts off saying, in addition to the impacts outlined above that are clearly regulated by DEM, the facility will also impact the environment in other ways as a result of construction and operation. Construction of the facility will require substantial clearing of upland areas. In both its advisory opinion and this supplemental advisory opinion, DEM has expressed concerns over such clearing, including impacts on upland ecosystems and habitat, as well as conserved and recreational lands, which are highly valued in this area of Rhode Island. That pretty much talks about the scope that you're talking about, correct? The upland areas?
I believe so.
Goes on to say, unlike proposed impacts to wetland ecosystems, proposed alterations of upland areas are not subject to similar regulation, and no standards for acceptable impacts are established in state or federal environmental law. You agree with that?
Yes.
Going on, without such standards, DEM is unable to render an opinion on whether these proposed impacts are acceptable or not. Do you agree with Mr. Gray's statement?
I do.
However, DEM strongly urges the EFSB to consider the foundation of the wetlands regulatory construct when evaluating this area, that such impacts must be avoided and minimized to the maximum extent practicable through specific conditions and requirements if the facility is ultimately approved. Do you agree with Mr. Gray's statement there?
Yes.
Okay. Let's go back, if we can, where Mr. McElroy started off, which I believe was page 10 of the original DEM advisory opinion, entitled at the top, Value of Forests in the Northwest Corner. You there?
Yes.
In that first paragraph, Mr. McElroy had read portions of it to you, but he failed to read the last sentence to you, which I will read now. As such, DEM has prioritized land acquisition and conservation on parcels in the immediate vicinity of the site. Did you write this paragraph?
No, I did not.
Right. Do you understand that DEM has prioritized land acquisition and conservation on parcels in the immediate vicinity of the site?
Yes.
Right. Do you know, or which lands are these addressing?
I don't know the exact sites or parcels that we've targeted. We have within planning and development, within the division department, I mean, we have land acquisition staff that have that prioritize identify and itemize parcels for review by the committee. I don't know exactly which ones over the course of time we've tried to explore.
And when you said division of planning, that is within DEM, correct?
Yes.
And at the break, before the break, I had requested a copy of an email that was provided to me, which discusses, as you said in your testimony, whether DEM has ever looked to acquire the 730 acres, correct?
Correct.
You have no personal knowledge of that, do you?
No, I do not.
All right. So what this email involves a woman named Michelle Sheehan.
Yes.
And what is her position, if you know, at the time of this email in 2000? Let me back up and start this. This email you sent on February 7th, 2019, asking whether or not DEM has ever investigated acquiring the property, correct?
Correct.
All right. And then your response back came from Michelle Sheehan, who said that staff met with Algonquin Gas back in 2009. Do you know what her position was in 2009?
Oh boy. I do not for certain. She did work contractually for us for a period of time through the Nature Conservancy before obtaining a full-time employment with the department. I'm not sure it goes back to 2009, but she is in charge. She's the primary contact for our land acquisition group, so she would have the information and data necessary to be able to make that statement.
So even though this was in 2009, is it fair to say that at least since 1996, I believe, when the DEM's Division of Planning and Development's document entitled Protecting Our Land Resources, a Land Acquisition and Protection Plan for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, published in May of 1996, the DEM has paid attention to this site.
That's correct.
Do you know if their interest goes back any further than 96?
Not from my knowledge. I mean, it may, but I only started with DEM in 2000.
In 2000?
2000.
Still looking at page 10, then in paragraph 2, where I just read off that document. Should we call that the land acquisition plan? That works?
That's fine.
Okay.
Yep.
It goes on to say that this document identified biodiversity focus areas in the state, the largest of which is referred to as the Western Forest and includes the western portions of Burrillville, Gloucester, Foster, Situate, and Coventry. You see that?
Yes.
Do you know how many acres total comprises the Western Forest?
Unfortunately, I do not.
Any guesses?
Thousands.
Thousands, okay. Is there a document anywhere that would tell me what that number is?
That number may be referred to in the Wildlife Action Plan. I'm not certain, to be honest. If we have a, actually, I'm certain we have that number, a round number. I just don't know what it is. Because now it's sort of evolved. I mean, that's the Western Forest, but Mr. Cummings, when he was here testifying, talked about the borderlands, and it is contiguous with the Western Forest and encroaches on the Western Forest, but that is all the way down into Hopkinton. It's more or less the western part of the state, from Hopkinton on up to Burrillville, and that tract that was identified earlier as the largest contiguous area between Boston and Washington, D.C.
But nowhere in any of these advisory opinions does DEM provide us with a number as to how many acres are in this Western Forest.
No, I don't believe so.
Going on then to page 11, the very top where we talk about the Rhode Island Resource Protection Project, RIRPP.
Yeah.
Do you know what year that was?
No, I do not.
going down to the next paragraph, the first sentence reads, "This area is no less a priority than it was 2 decades prior." Can you just explain what that means?
Well, I agree with that. This was set as a priority long before this project, decades before this project, for the reasons that I described earlier, and its value as far as large, contiguous, unfragmented, unique habitat communities. And if anything, I state that the importance of this area has been elevated with the increased encroachment and fragmentation over time throughout the decades within the state. So it was a priority in '96. It's a higher priority, in my opinion, now because of the amount of development within the state.
When you're talking about the development, is that pertain to, say, residential and commercial development?
Residential, commercial, industrial. They all are they have similar impacts, and they're all different types of fragmentation, encroachment on the habitats.
But in terms of, is it fair to say that roadway development is also a high concern area to minimize roadfront development?
Yes. Roads invite a variety of stressors on an environment, including direct mortality, spread of invasive species, others.
And you're aware that this project has approximately 1,800 feet from Wallen Lake Road to the power block of vegetated forest that will not be impacted.
Could you repeat that?
Are you aware that there's 1,800 feet of buffer from Wallen, vegetated buffer, from Wallen Lake Road to the power block?
Yes.
I think one other area you've also talked about are residential subdivisions.
Yes.
And why is that an area of concerns?
In the context of...
Fragmentation.
It's similar in that it's similar to a type of fragmentation. You know, you're basically clearing an area and creating a development. There are other factors that are unique maybe to this site that maybe, or this project, that you may or may not suffer with residential development. For example, noise, significant lighting. Those are potentially different than a typical subdivision. But the factors related to land clearing, fragmentation, increased human occupancy, noise, lighting, invasive plants, exotic plants, they're all relatively similar.
But to date, none of the 730 acres of the Spectral property has been acquired for conservation by either the state or the town of Burville or any other entity, correct?
No. But we would be interested.
So it still remains in private ownership?
Yes.
Now I'd like to continue on to page 11 in that same paragraph, which mentions the 2015 Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan. We've spent a lot of time talking about that. Can you tell me your familiarity with that document?
I have intimate familiarity with it. Not all portions. It's a very large document, but the Wildlife Action Plan was a criteria for eligibility of federal funding. So as I described earlier, there's an apportionment program whereby states can receive additional federal funds for conservation for fish and wildlife. As part of the criteria, in 2004, all states, in order to be eligible, were required to write a wildlife action plan. And so that's now in its second passing of that. That was 2015 was when we wrote our last plan.
So there have been 2 plans so far, the 2005 and the 2015, correct?
Correct.
On page 18 of the original advisory opinion, there is a footnote 29 which references Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan 2005. My question to you is, why was this cited versus the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan, if you know?
I don't know for certain. The only thing I could speculate at this point would be in that version of the plan, that sentence that it was referenced there relates to the 2005 plan, which may or may not still be present in the 2015 plan.
And that's the line...
Invasive species are one of the most ubiquitous and severe threats to wildlife and their habitats.
So what you're saying possibly is that that was not included in the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan?
I don't know. I didn't write this one. My staff wrote that, and I can only speculate that's why she referenced the 2005 rather than the more current plan. I don't think it was with the intent, or I actually wouldn't. I would guess that.
Let me stop you
yeah,
there.
Okay.
You're here to testify.
Speculate why she. Yeah.
Yeah. Please tell us what you know. If you don't know, that's fair.
Okay.
Continuing on through the original advisory opinion, you talked about how determining, I think, these wildlife corridor areas are an inexact science.
Yes.
Isn't that sort of contraindicated to say science and inexact?
Well, it's, I guess you could say that, but it's sort of like how I described the inventory, as far in that many species are very difficult to monitor for a variety of reasons, and this is why you have to take an approach that's multi-year, fully encompassing of seasonality. Because of that, and because of the diversity of thousands of species that we have in the state, we don't have information in detail on all of these species, so from a planning perspective and looking at habitats, which are really the foundation to be used to identify what likely species would be in an area and what criteria are necessary given what we do know. Yeah, we often have to draw our sideboards somewhere, but we don't maybe know exactly where the edges of the parameter, because you're trying to consider thousands of species of needs, and some of which you don't have information for.
Can you just explain sideboard? How you...
Well, it's just the border. So, a lot of these plans that you'll see, they're polygons. You basically draw on polygons, and it's not haphazardly done. In some of the plans that we referred to that Nature Conservancy has developed, there's been significant high-level statistical modeling that's gone into developing these polygons. But ultimately, they're utilizing the data that was inputted, and so shifts in those data may cause shifts in the polygons. Where you gain lots of confidence is as you get away from the edges of those polygons, you feel very confident that those are meeting the criteria that you've set out for.
So as you said, some of them, they can be narrower or larger, you said?
That could be the case.
And there's some give and take on them?
Yes, and I would say from DEM's perspective and within our Wildlife Action Plan, I can assure you that we at all steps, we're attempting to be conservative with our designations.
But may I just ask, how many scientists were involved in the Wildlife Action Plan?
Yeah, like 50 maybe. We had partners from the university, out-of-state universities, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, within DEM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was a very comprehensive plan with a lot of expertise weighed into development of this plan.
Director, I'm actually going to go into that. I believe there's a listing of who's involved, and we'll go through that for a bit.
Okay.
going back to where you talked about the modeling of the polygons, based on this site that we're looking at, we have the information from ESS. Are you aware of any other biological inventory that has been done on the site?
To the extent that ESS performed?
Anyone else? My question is, are you aware, or DEM I say, is DEM aware of any other biological inventory that has been done on the Spectra property, the 730-acre property?
I believe portions of it are when we had a heritage program. Our heritage program identifies species on portions of the property, not within their limited disturbance of this site, but that's not to say that they didn't visit that. I just don't have any data to support whether they did or not.
In this project area in particular, the smaller 67-acre parcel, aside from what ESS has done, are you aware of any biological inventories that have been done on that property?
No, I'm not.
You talked a bit about obstruction and barriers to large and medium mammals. You recall that?
Yes.
And how fencing can be a barrier.
Yes.
Okay. You're aware that on the proposed site, the fencing is only on the power block, correct?
Yes.
And are you aware that the proposed wood road access coming into the site is no longer proposed as an access?
Yes.
And were you familiar with Mr. Winkler's testimony here, where he talked about the benefits of not using Woods Road and in fact using Algonquin Lane for permanent access and a temporary construction access?
Yes.
All right. Do you have any opinion as to whether or not the removal of Woods Road and all the culverts and retaining walls would be one area of, say, avoidance or minimization?
I would say that it's an attempt of minimization, to utilize that existing road.
And you're aware that there will be no fencing on Algonquin Lane or on the temporary access road, correct?
That's correct.
So the areas that we have fenced out on this property are the already disturbed Algonquin compressor station and the power block.
And the power, yes.
Give me a moment here. Back to, I believe we're about on page 19. And this is the section that started on page 18 that we talked about earlier about invasive species. At the top of page 19 is entitled Impact on Habitat from Construction Activities. Are you familiar with this section?
Yes.
And here it says the applicant should restrict tree cutting and vegetation removal to a fall-winter timeframe to avoid the breeding season for most wildlife, and not just that of any threatened species identified in the areas to be cleared as proposed. The applicant has offered to consult with state and federal agencies and implement reasonable measures to limit impacts to wildlife during construction. We agree that such consultation would be productive. You agree with that?
Yes.
And just to be clear, when Mr. McElroy had asked you about species and an understanding of endangered versus state threatened, there are no, to your knowledge, there are no federal endangered species on the proposed site, correct?
Not to my knowledge, no, there are not.
And similarly, there are no state endangered species on the proposed site, to your knowledge?
I believe the ESS report identifies cerulean warbler, which is state endangered. And our breeding bird atlas also identified that species. I don't know if it was within the footprint of the site, but within the approximate area.
Now, in your comments here today, you have talked about how the inventory, biological inventory, should be multi-season, multi-year, correct?
Correct.
There are no DEM regulations outlining how to do a biological inventory, are there?
No, there are not.
And although you like to look at Exhibit 213, please.
What document is that?
Exhibit 213, this is the exchange between DEM and ESS on the biodiversity inventory summary. Mr. Osenkowski, if you can take a look at Exhibit 213, it contains correspondence from Mr. Gagnon at DEM to Mike Feinblatt at the ESS group. Have you seen this correspondence before?
Yes.
All right. And did you have any input or comment? Let me just finish up. Did you have any input or comment into the letter that Mr. Gagnon sent to Mr. Feinblatt?
I reviewed it prior to it being sent. My staff worked on it.
And is it fair to say that contained within Mr. Gagnon's correspondence, there are no requests to extend the survey time or seasonality to longer than what? Let me strike that and start all over again. Is it fair to say that contained within Mr. Gagnon's letter, there are no requests or recommendations to extend the time of the survey either to more seasons or more years?
Not within this letter. We stated that in the advisory opinion.
But not as part of this pending application, correct? The wetlands application?
Not as part of the wetlands application. It was my understanding we were responding to the advisory board's request to provide this information, not on how to conduct a thorough biological inventory of an area.
Can you read that answer back to me? When you say we were responding, which document are you talking about?
We were ESSS biological inventory. I forget the title, but I think it was biological report or something. It wasn't. We were responding to the methodology that was described in there and reviewing that document and trying to provide information on how to provide a more robust survey effort.
And again, in this June 13th, 2017 letter from Mr. Gagnon, there are no recommendations to expand the temporal limits of the survey.
Correct.
I'm confused. When you said we are responding, are you talking about the advisory opinion or are you talking about this letter?
This letter was in response to the biological inventory.
Okay.
The methodology used within that inventory.
Okay.
In the advisory opinion, we did note, I believe several times, the desire to have a more expansive inventory over spatial scale, expansive, not technique-wise.
In that one, in the advisory opinion, you were looking for multi-year,
Yes.
correct? Going to the next letter contained in Exhibit 213 would be a response from the ESS group to Mr. Gagnon. Do you see that?
Yes,
Have you seen that before?
only recently.
And when did you see that?
Within the past 2 weeks.
So did you review this as part of your preparation for your testimony?
Yes.
I know I asked you that question earlier, but as you sit here, can you think of anything else you reviewed to prepare for your testimony? Because we didn't talk about these letters.
No.
Did you meet with anyone aside from your attorney to discuss your testimony here?
Just a second. I go back to say, I mean, no, not that I can describe, but I have a file like this. And within that file there are certain things that I reviewed. I can't give you the titles or exactly. I know the Department of Health advisory opinion I didn't review. But there were documents, plans within the files, upon files that I've received that I've looked at. Sorry.
I get it. I'm not trying to play gotcha. I'm just trying to understand what you did to prepare for your testimony. Trust me, I know how much paper there is. So looking at this letter, which from Mr. Feinblatt dated June 19th, 2017, which is part of Exhibit 213, you did not review it, let's say in 2017, did you?
No, I did not.
So you were never asked to provide any comments on ESS's response to Mr. Gagnon's letter?
I personally was not, no.
Do you know of anyone else who was asked to review this back in 2017?
I don't know,
Okay.
but I should
That's fair.
expect the staff were.
But again, it would probably be wetlands staff, wetlands permitting staff?
Yes.
And but again, so for an applicant like Invenergy, who seeks out DEM's comment on their survey, and then they receive comments, there's no other place for an applicant to look on how to do a biological survey, is there?
Well, there is. It's how, many biologists look through peer-reviewed literature to identify how to conduct a survey. I mean, that's what our staff does. We don't have written protocol that cover all species or advise on how to conduct surveys for species, but we all, as professionals, turn to peer-reviewed literature to identify how to conduct those surveys in the time frame that would be most applicable for those surveys.
Do you still hold the professional wetlands certification?
No, I do not. You keep bringing me back to wetlands, and I want to forget all about working
Sorry,
as a consultant in wetlands and permitting.
One moment. So when Mr. Horbert was here last week, we established that he was the person who would ultimately be signing off on the wetlands permit, either to grant or deny it. And you're familiar with that testimony from last week. And in this case, is it fair to say that you have no involvement in the freshwater wetlands permitting?
I have no involvement.
And aside from that permitting, in your area that you're testifying about today, there is no other permitting through write-in, correct?
That's correct.
Did you just say there's no other permitting beyond the wetland permitting?
In his area.
Oh,
I meant,
okay, thank you.
It meant in his area.
Okay,
No.
Okay, missed that. Maybe it was that strange tone.
Okay. So we were talking about the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan, if we can go to that. And you have in front of you, I hope, the, what's called Chapter 7 of the plan.
Yes, sir.
And are you familiar with that chapter?
In 2015, I can be familiar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Wildlife Action Plan is referred to throughout the DEM advisory opinions, correct?
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about that. And to the chair, I would like to have administrative notice taken of the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan, Chapter 7, entitled Outreach and Coordination with Partners, Stakeholders, and the Public. We provided copies of this to council. I believe CLF indicated last evening. I'm not sure if they had no objection to it. I don't believe we've heard from the town.
Town has no objection.
I did indicate to Invenergy that CLF would interpose no objection. That continues to be the case. I do want to note for the record that the EFSB rules required that matters be presented by April 1st, 2018. This is rather belated. We have no objection. We are happy to have it come in.
We take administrative notice.
Thank you. What was your role in this 2015 Wildlife Action Plan generally?
I had variable roles, various roles of oversight, administration, along with Scott Cummings and a consultant. But then I had more engaged role in the bird section of the plan, identifying species of greatest conservation concern, because that's my area of expertise prior to being an administrator.
Let's go to the first page, numbered page. It says 7-1 at the bottom, and oh, I'm sorry, actually, I'm at the cover page. We're going to go to the cover page. At the bottom of it, it's got 3 blocks, I guess. It says the Nature Conservancy, DEM, and the University of Rhode Island, correct?
Correct.
How did those 3 entities work together to collaborate on the plan?
We worked very closely together. The Nature Conservancy had a contract through our division along with a consultant to help develop the plan on behalf of the state and in with conjunction with the state Department of Environmental Management. And our major partner in that effort was the University of Rhode Island and various professors from the university where they had expertise.
And when you said the Nature Conservancy had a contract, is that between DEM and the Nature Conservancy?
Yes.
And they were hired and presumably paid by DEM?
They, ultimately, we had a group to Williger. We had another consultant who ultimately was responsible for the plan, for drafting the plan, coordinating meetings, and moving the plan forward.
That is the Terwilliger Consulting Inc. It's Terwillger.
That's correct.
And Karen Terwilliger was the contact?
The lead, yes. Yep.
Is that contract with the Nature Conservancy still in place with DEM?
I do not believe so, no.
And in doing both the 2005 and the 2015 wildlife action plan, is it correct to say that by the state preparing it and implementing it, that they received funds from the federal government?
The state Department of Environmental Management received funding from, yes, the federal government.
And was a portion of those fundings earmarked for conservation of land?
For development of the wildlife action plan, they can be utilized for land acquisition.
And do you know, as you sit here today, if any of those funds from either the 2005 or the 2015 plan were used for acquisition?
For implementation of the plan, their funds were used for acquisition, not for the planning document itself or planning process. That was a separate, same agency providing the funding, but we had phased funding. Basically, there was funding to develop a plan, and then there was funding to implement actions that identified in the plan, of which land acquisition was identified, and we have pursued with land acquisition utilizing those funds. The funds resulting from the development of this plan are, you can find them under state wildlife grants. That would be the term that's used.
And again, as you sit here today, do you know from 2005 to the present if there were any properties that were acquired by DEM in the Western Forest?
Yes. I'm trying to think of all the properties I mean, it's complex. I'm being on the spot. I really need to see the table because we acquire a lot of land annually and combine funding from various programs. So have state wildlife grant money been used in the Western Forest? I guess it depends the extent of it. I'm trying to think.
Well, without forcing you to...
Of the parcels that we bought.
Without forcing you to be on the spot, let's narrow it down to the town of Burrville. Are you aware of any state acquisition of property for conservation purposes in Burrville since 2005?
Yes.
Do you know which ones those are?
Boy Scout property. There's been others, but I would have had to know this up front and have the table in front of me to figure out the timeline and the parcels.
We've talked here in this hearing about the Boy Scout property before, but
Okay.
but that's what comes to your mind is the major Burville.
Yeah, that's the most significant one, acquisition.
Okay. Let's turn to page 7-1 of the Chapter 7 of the Wildlife Action Plan. And it starts off in the first paragraph at the top after introduction. This chapter describes how RI, DEM, DFW, which would be the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Department of Fish and Wildlife, correct?
That's correct.
We don't like acronyms around here, so. Coordinated with partners in the development of this RIWAP, Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan, and how it will continue to work with and through its partners in the implementation of this wildlife conservation strategy, element 7. Opportunities to use existing partnerships and create new ones to implement the RIWAP are also described in this chapter. Mr. Osenkowski, are you familiar with this introduction portion of the plan?
Generally, yes.
And how, I think you've told us at least how it worked among the three major entities that were on the front of the plan. But is it fair to say that in this plan it then goes on to describe that there are 3 tiers of the public that are described on page, starting at page 7-2? And at the bottom, it starts with Tier 1, partners, collaborators with significant role and or program. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And it includes, it lists a number of Rhode Island entities that are involved, and going on to the next page where it says partners/collaborators include, and it says RIDEM internal partners, DFW freshwater fisheries, marine fisheries, wildlife, planning and development, natural heritage program, forestry, wetlands, etc. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so in developing this wildlife action plan, both in 2005 and 2015, those were the internal DEM entities that were involved, correct?
That's correct.
Then the next one goes on to say DEM external partners, RIGIS, RIDA, CRMC, RIDOT, municipalities, and then it goes on listing a number at the top of page 7-3. Where it says municipalities, are you aware if the town of Burville was involved at all in the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan?
I am not aware. I know that we did seek full engagement, so I don't know all the partners that opted to engage, but we did seek inclusive engagement.
Similar to engaging like the planning board and the conservation commissions that you were on in Coventry. Those are the type of
That's
entities.
correct, yes. But typically in this process, I would state that the town planners were notified. So it wasn't limited to their, land trust or conservation commission. It would have gone through the planner.
Right, because some of the land trusts are private entities, so instead
That's correct. Sorry.
So instead, you reach out to the planners in the communities who are, designated by statute as the representative of the town in these planning issues, correct?
Yes.
Now on page 7-4, there's a section at the bottom of the page entitled Opportunities for WAP Implementation Outreach. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it talks about at the last sentence in that paragraph, starting 4 lines up. In addition to the development of species and habitat profiles, stakeholders in the public will be kept informed and involved throughout the next 10-year implementation stage through the Community Companion Guide to the WAP and the WAP document products and the continued coordination and updates. Do you see that?
Yes.
We have a copy of the Community Companion Guide. Do you have those? This is the document that I'd like to... And do you have one? Oh, great. Okay, good. You have that in front of you. Are you familiar with that document?
Yes.
Okay. In fact, some of the photos in there are attributed to you, right?
Yes.
That's titled the Community Wildlife Conservation Guide.
Correct. And And I would ask if we can take administrative notice of this document. It has been provided to council last week.
Is there objection?
No objection from the town.
No objection, with the same note about tardiness. No objection.
Let me make a point about tardiness. This is in fact items including the WAP.
That's okay. We will take administrative notice.
Thank you. What was your role in the Community Wildlife Conservation Guide?
I didn't directly draft it. I was involved in it in providing information, review. This was really, intent of this was to sort of be a condensed, more user-friendly version of the Wildlife Action Plan. Sorry. I didn't even pay attention. Who was sneezing?
The stenographer. So take a breath.
A more user-friendly version of the Wildlife Action Plan. The Wildlife Action Plan is very robust, over 300 pages, and our experience from the 2005 Wildlife Action Plan and my experience having worked within town for so long was that it was, in my opinion, that towns would not read a document that thick and be expected to also implement it to their town. So this was sort of a Cliff Notes version, I guess I'd say, of the Wildlife Action Plan.
Well, you answered the next question on my list, which was what was the purpose of the community guide. So is it fair to say that it is an implementation document, so user-friendly for municipalities and other stakeholders?
Yes, it's meant so that if they are interested, they could then refer to the plan for any specifics, but it's fairly comprehensive itself.
I'm going to go back to the Chapter 7, if we can right now. And on page 7-8, there is a table 7-2 entitled RIWAP Committees, Teams, Members, and Affiliations. Do you see that?
Yes.
All right, and starting at the very top, it says the RIWAP Core Steering Committee. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first person listed is Scott Cummings of the Nature Conservancy.
Yes.
And you're also listed for DEM, correct?
That's correct.
Right. And again, this was when this was done, Nature Conservancy was a paid consultant to DEM.
That's correct.
You are also on the technical team for birds and the GIS team, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Cummings is not only on the steering committee, but he was also a member of the outreach team, which is that second category, correct?
Yes.
And he was also on the technical bird team with you.
Correct.
Is it fair to say that the Nature Conservancy was an integral part of the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan?
Absolutely.
What was the role of the steering committee?
To guide the plan development, make decisions about what, who is engaged, and components of the plan. Although that said, given the criteria from the federal government, a lot of the components and chapters are in the plan, within the plan are criteria for all states, so there's consistency.
I was going to ask you that next, exactly. So the federal program gave you, if you will, categories or areas that had to be complied with, and that was what this Rhode Island's plan was following.
That's correct, and we were making sure we hit those benchmarks along with hearings and engagement. Those were also criteria that we needed to make sure we achieved in developing the plan.
Did you coordinate with any other states that were doing their plan?
We coordinated in that we did have dialogue between states, but as far as how the state's priorities were, I would say there wasn't uniform coordination on prioritization, and that had more to do with the timing of plans. So we were actually the first to submit our plan to the federal government. We finished first, but there were states that were a year behind us. And we really couldn't wait for states to align with our process. We had engagement in funding when we did, so we had to just move forward. So that was a benefit and a negative. Kind of set the trend in a way, but then some states came up with novel modeling for some species or something that we weren't able to utilize.
So in terms of related to this project, which is on the northwest corner of the state, there was no coordination with Connecticut or Massachusetts, as you just described?
Not with the plan, but there has been throughout the decades with Connecticut and Massachusetts. We all recognize, all the divisions of Fish and Wildlife and the agencies of the surrounding states all recognize the importance of this area and the goal of attempting on their end and our end the preservation of that habitat.
We talked earlier how on page 7-3 municipalities were listed as tier 1 partners or collaborators, you recall that?
Yes.
However, in these lists of table 7-2, I don't see any municipalities listed on the core steering committee, on the outreach team, or anywhere. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Next, turn to page 7-11. The first full paragraph. Six lines down. Actually, the place where it starts, partner outreach, that section, and then 6 lines down, starts about small, informal, focused meetings were held with key local, state, federal, and tribal partners around the state to encourage more detailed and meaningful input during each step. Do you see that?
I don't see, but
Right.
I heard it.
Yeah, it's up on the screen. It's got a little red bullet. There we go. Okay, thank you for that. Did the town of Burville ever participate in this type of meeting?
I can't recall. I mean, I would just go back to, we did attempt to engage all the municipalities. As far as these committees and boards, they were fairly specific, high expertise. Anyone was welcome to provide input, but you'll see that it's pretty narrow in who had the expertise to provide input. It wasn't because we didn't solicit input. I know you'll notice that there are several conservation land trust agencies, private agencies, that did interact with us fairly well. But unfortunately, many of the town land trusts or municipality staff did not engage. Either they didn't feel they had the expertise or just weren't feeling like they knew where to fit in. We did try to reach out to people to allow engagement.
I'm going to get to this a little more later in detail, but isn't part of the recommendations, or aren't part of the recommendations in the Community Wildlife Conservation Guide that municipalities conform their comprehensive plans to what's in the Wildlife Action Plan?
That's our hope. We don't have any regulatory avenue to force that upon a municipality. It's really for them to opt to engagement. In my experience, my personal experience, that has to do a lot with staffing of individual towns and what their capacity is and how well they understand, land conservation and whether their priorities meet what our priorities are, which are conservation and preservation of species.
Well, in that vein, Burville does have a conservation commission. Do you know whether or not that conservation commission ever participated in any type of the meeting set out in the partner outreach set forth on page 711?
I can't recall. We do have, we did compile a list of everyone who was contacted. They obviously weren't engaged to the level where they were assigned a committee responsibility. So I don't know where Burville stood in that.
finally, just to round it out, do you recall whether the Burrillville Land Trust ever participated in any of these types of meetings?
I do not recall.
Could I just state for the record, I think Ms. Noonan knows, but the Burrillville Land Trust is not associated with the town of Burrillville.
I understand. Let me ask you then, is a private land trust, are those some of the interested parties or stakeholders that you would look to for input under this wildlife action plan?
Yes.
I'd like to go to page 718. I need my glasses. 716, please. And that says collaboration with local partners. You see that there?
Yes.
And that starts off on the very first line under there, the first paragraph. Rhode Island municipalities are key partners with RIDEM in the conservation of the state's natural resources. You agree with that, correct?
Yes.
And then it goes on to say that in the next paragraph, the comprehensive community plan that each municipality is required to develop and maintain on a 5-year update schedule, guide local land use planning, and provide an opportunity to implement Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan conservation actions on a local level. RIDEM has existing partnerships with several municipal organizations and governments, some of which are highlighted below. You see that?
I do.
And as we sit here and looking at this, I've gone through this, I don't see the town of Burrillville listed specifically anywhere. Correct?
I haven't reviewed it to see if Burrillville was in here, but I'll go on based on what you're saying.
Subject to check. I didn't find it. Continuing on. 717, again, there's a section regarding conservation commissions. And the first paragraph reads, conservation commissions are another asset that most 34 out of 39 Rhode Island municipalities have available to them as a valuable conservation resource. As a former member of the Conservation Commission, I assume you would agree with that?
Yes.
And they then cite the next section talking about Rhode Island General Laws 4535-1 through 45-35-4, which enables city or town councils to create 3 to 7 member conservation commissions, the purpose of which is to promote and develop the natural resources, protect the watershed resources, and preserve natural aesthetic areas within municipalities. And again, at this point, as you sit here, you don't recall if Burrillville participated at all in your wildlife action plan review, correct?
Not that I recall.
And then finally, just to finish up, it then states that the statute also asserts that the commissions research local land and seek to coordinate with like-minded non-governmental groups, and that they may recommend to municipal councils, boards, or agencies a program for the better promotion, development, utilization, or preservation of open areas, streams, shores, wooded areas, roadsides, swamps, marshlands, and natural aesthetic areas. Do you have anything to comment on about that?
Not specifically. I guess I would just reiterate that we engaged with all the municipalities. Whether they sought to engage with us, I can't confirm. We did have at that time, we still have employed a community liaison that came out of this funding that works with towns and does attempt to address towns' concerns and help them with engagement with the Wildlife Action Plan.
And do you have any knowledge whether the town of Burrillville ever made any recommendations, whether the Burrillville Conservation Commissions made any recommendation to the town of Burrillville for a program to preserve the wooded areas which is now the subject of your testimony on forest fragmentation?
I do not have any personal knowledge.
Are you aware that the proposed site is located in an F5 residential agricultural zone in Burville?
I was not aware.
And are you aware that the F5 designation was not intended to limit development in F5 zones to agricultural residential usage, but simply was a designation for land outside of the developed core areas of the town?
I really cannot speak to Burville's subdivision or comp plan or any municipal regulations. I'm not familiar.
But you would agree that part of the Wildlife Action Plan and the Community Guide is to encourage municipalities to enact local regulations because of the lack of regulation on the state level?
Yes.
And are you aware that other uses in Burville in the F5 zone include sewage treatment plants and solid waste facilities by special use permit?
I was not aware.
And are you aware that in December of 1987, an electric generating facility was defined as a special use, then a special exception for an F5 zone by unanimous vote of the Burville Town Council?
I was not aware. It's not unusual to have variances like that.
I'd like to turn to page 7, still on page 717, where the topic goes into local comprehensive plans. And while you may not have knowledge specifically of Burville's, you are aware of what the comp plan structure is, correct?
Yes.
And it's mandated under state law that each municipality do a comp plan that then has to be approved by statewide planning, correct?
That's correct.
And when the comp plan is passed by a municipality, it's passed by the town council, right?
Correct.
Okay. And in this case, in that section under local comprehensive plans, it says Rhode Island has what can be referred to as a reciprocal land use planning system, whereas the state guide plan establishes overarching long-range goals and policies. Municipalities must set their individual long-range priorities via community comprehensive plans. You agree with that?
I agree with that. But again, I don't have any intimate knowledge. I mean, I work for the Department of Environmental Management as Deputy Chief of Division of Fish and Wildlife. We're kind of getting into a realm, in my opinion, of local town roles. And while I am on a town, I'm not representing a town, a municipality, or the structure of how zoning and ordinances or regs are developed or comp plans. So I could speak based on personal knowledge and not based on expertise of representing a municipality and how that process works.
Well, let me, I do reference your Coventry representation. My in-laws live there, so we thank you for your service there. But this is part of the DEM advisory opinion, the Wildlife Action Plan. So I'm looking at Chapter 7. So this is,
okay.
It's fair enough that it's within the scope of your testimony. For the comprehensive plans, going down to the second paragraph, it says, comprehensive plans are influential documents in terms of conservation and development in Rhode Island. They essentially provide a blueprint for each community by laying out its long-range goals, formulating an implementation to achieve those goals, and serving as the foundation for municipal zoning. From the position of DEM, fair to say that you are looking to the town to put some teeth into their ordinances for conservation purposes.
That's correct.
Right. In terms of zoning, do you know whether or not the town of Burville ever changed its zoning for this site to prohibit any land development?
I'm not aware.
And then going down to the rest of the paragraph, sort of echoes what you were saying. While municipalities have the authority to enact conservation, however, many are short on time, finances, and/or expertise necessary to follow through. In fact, only 13 of Rhode Island's 39 cities and towns presently have a fully approved comprehensive plan. Are you aware that Burville in 2015 did have an approved comprehensive plan?
I was not aware.
Okay. And then finally, under these circumstances, partnerships become particularly vital. Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan aims to provide guidance to make conservation work more efficient and thus more cost-effective for Rhode Island's cities and towns. It's fair to say that DEM is trying to help the municipalities, again, put some teeth into their laws through the Wildlife Action Plan and the suggestions therein.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, that's a large part of the intent of this is a guidance document. We can't force it upon towns, but we're hoping to provide them with the information and so that our conservation can be consistent across the state so that we can achieve our bigger goals.
And in terms of your bigger goals, are you familiar with the document called Land Use Guide 2025?
Yes.
What is that?
That's a guidance document, basically for how land use could be designed.
And is that...
Having residential, go ahead, sorry.
No, you finished, I'm sorry.
Just having the different elements of opportunities within a landscape.
And is it fair to say that it is the Department of Administration statewide planning that promulgates the Land Use Guide 2025?
Yes.
And do you understand that the Land Use 2025 and the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan work together?
Yes.
Right. And so let's... Just have a moment. I want to go back to page 714, entitled Department of Administration Statewide Planning Guide. Program, I just make up words here. I'd like to go down to maybe like the bottom third of that paragraph. And it says, starting with the shared goal of land use 2025. You have that?
Yes.
Read that. The shared goal of Land Use 2025 in the Rhode Island WAP is to return to a land use vision that promotes an urban-rural distinction and in so doing leaves wild and other undeveloped places for future generations of Rhode Islanders and wildlife. As Rhode Island's primary plan for conservation and development in the 21st century, Land Use 2025 articulates the state's overarching goals, objectives, and strategies to guide and coordinate the land use plans and regulations of municipalities and state agencies and to direct good strategic projects at both the state and municipal level. Is that consistent with your understanding of the interplay between Land Use 2025 and the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan?
Yes.
And to finish that, it says, it is mandatory that the goals and policies of Land Use 2025 and all elements of the state guide plan be reflected in the municipal comprehensive plans. You see that?
Yeah, I do.
So essentially that is a directive that goes from planning Land Use 2025 to the municipalities, correct?
Yes.
And the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan assists with it, but it is not a regulatory document, correct?
That's correct, yeah. We basically engaged in that process like others. You know, we've engaged to the point where we've offered what we think with the Wildlife Action Plan we suggest for towns to implement, whether the land use plan incorporates that is in our discretion.
In fact, the land use plan is the governing document for the state, correct?
Yes.
And I think I asked you this before, but I know there was mounds of documents you said, but did you review any of the statewide planning advisory opinions prior to your testimony?
I did not.
You just saved us a lot of time.
Wonderful. Looking at midnight now.
I'd like to turn to page 729 of this document. And it talks about collaboration with non-governmental organization partners. And the first one listed is the Nature Conservancy Rhode Island chapter. You see that?
Yes.
And again, it's in the first paragraph in that category, in that heading rather, through a cooperative agreement with RIDEM, the Rhode Island chapter of the Nature Conservancy has led all facets of the revision of this RIWAP. In addition to this guide, RIDEM frequently collaborates with the Nature Conservancy on conservation planning, restoration, land acquisition, and stewardship at many levels. This strong partnership between RIDEM and the Nature Conservancy has led to the implementation of many conservation actions identified in the 2005 CWCS on both the Nature Conservancy and RIDEM lands and in the water. Can you tell us what the CWCS is?
Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation Strategy.
And do you know whether the Nature Conservancy acquired any property in Burville from 2005 for conservation purposes?
2005. I do not. I would say it dates more or less the relationship we have. I mean, we partner with the Nature Conservancy and others very often. In a small state, we're forced to partner with whoever we can, especially as it relates to land acquisition. Usually strengthens the acquisition and buys more engagement from stakeholders. So partnering with the Nature Conservancy is not unique, but they are a strong partner for us.
And in this instance, for the Wildlife Action Plan, as we've established, they were a paid partner.
That's correct.
I'd like to turn now to the other document, the Community Wildlife Conservation Guide. And if I just call this the guide, we'll understand what we're talking about. Save some words. Okay. Can you turn to page, make sure I got this right. Page 3.
That was the page I hope you turned to.
Good.
Now you can see what a black-throated blue warbler looks like.
With a photo by Jay.
I took that picture.
Photo by Jay Osenkowski.
Yeah.
Yep, there
I
we
worked
go.
with them for 2 years at Dartmouth.
You're welcome. I brought you the pictures.
Bring a smile to my face.
I'm glad I could do that for you, Mr. Osenkowski. We're short of those around here sometimes. Let's look at the caption of that, Chapter 2, Why It's Important to Keep Rhode Island Wild. You see
That is
that?
a great picture.
You're on page 3?
Yes, at the top.
Okay. Right.
If you look at the mitigation plan, that bird's also on the Ailes property, the new mitigation plan we just filed. So this category is talking about why it's important to keep Rhode Island wild. And I want to go to page 9, which is still within that same section. And there we have the New England cottontail. Is that Brian Teff's picture, right?
Yes.
Okay. This talks about turning the tide, how local conservation helps. Is this an example of sort of the user-friendly guide for the implementation of the Wildlife Action Plan?
That's the intent.
And I'd like to look at the first paragraph again. It says Rhode Island has what can be referred to as reciprocal land use planning system, whereas the state guide plan establishes overarching long-range goals and policies. Municipalities must set their individual long-range priorities via community comprehensive plans. In bold, it says these plans must be reviewed and approved by the state to ensure consistency with the Rhode Island Comprehensive Plan and Land Use Act and State Guide Plan. End of the quote. You understand that that approval comes from statewide planning and not DEM, correct?
Yes.
Going to the next paragraph, it says, for conservation at the municipal and regional scale, conservation planning needs to be institutionalized so that a community's open spaces and wildlife habitat is not undermined project by project. Proactive wildlife conservation at any scale, 1, identifies rare and vulnerable species, and 2, works to keep common species common. You agree with that?
Yes.
Earlier, we had talked about surveys of what's on any property, and I had asked you if you had any knowledge if there were any surveys done on this property, the subject property aside from ESS's, correct?
Correct.
And back in 2009, when DEM approached Spectra or Algonquin Gas about buying the property, do you know if they ever asked if they could do on-site surveys of animals on the parcels?
I couldn't state absolutely, I couldn't state absolutely. I do vaguely remember our fisheries biologists asking permission to conduct surveys on the property. The time frame, I'm not certain.
But it would be something, if the property owner agreed, DEM might be able to go in and do the survey to get you some more information about what's on this site.
That's correct. Yeah, we typically, I mean, obviously we can't cover all properties in every foot of the state. And then where it comes to private property, we really seek to get permission prior to entry, so.
Sure, please, yes.
Yeah.
But certainly, given the priority that you and Mr. Cummings have indicated is so important for this property, and yet no one ever inquired or pressed Spectra further to see if there could be a survey actually done on the property, correct?
That's correct. I would say that you're thinking, or I'm thinking, in a context of the larger landscape, though. The Western Block is important. We cannot cover the ground for every parcel within the Western Block. We just don't have the staffing. Love to. That's the ideal. But as a result of the small staff that we have, we rely a lot on GIS data and previous information to gain insight on species that are likely to be on a property. You know, it's fairly common to be able to look at a property, identify the habitat types, know what species are generally associated with those habitat types, and make speculations from there. We just don't have the staffing to be able to do that type of survey effort for every parcel.
And when I had asked you earlier the size of the Western Forest, you couldn't put it in terms of acreage, but what you're telling me is it's too big for current DEM staff to do that sort of review.
Absolutely. I mean, we don't even have a heritage or endangered non-game program any longer.
That was terminated, what, around 2000 or earlier?
The heritage program, I believe that retirement was in 2005-06. We haven't had a program since, and non-game endangered and threatened, we haven't ever had more than one staff, and that he retired last year. So that's thousands of species.
Now two.
Not quite just me.
Okay.
But we have a lot of responsibilities. This is just one component of it.
Understood. I'm going to go to the next, third paragraph on page 9 of the guide. It is very important to note that neither RIWAP nor this guidance is regulatory. It is equally important to remember that the regulatory frameworks that currently exist for protecting wildlife in Rhode Island are inadequate, and that this lack of regulatory authority at the state level makes proactive, collaborative conservation to protect all wildlife at the local level even more imperative. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
I'd like to go to page 14. Entitled Key Conservation Partners and Available Opportunities. Do you see that?
Yes.
Go down to the section, bottom third of the page, that says the Division of Planning's statewide planning program and the state guide plans land use 2025. The first sentence says the Rhode Island Division of Planning within the Department of Administration provides centralized state planning through the Rhode Island State Guide Plan. The system of plans and state guide plan element 121-Land Use 2025 in particular contains goals, policies, and actions for the protection of natural resources, including beaches and wetlands, farmlands and forests, greenways, and green space. See that?
I do.
and that essentially repeats what we saw in the Wildlife Action Plan going on. The overarching vision of Land Use 2025 is that Rhode Island will be a constellation of community centers connected by infrastructure corridors framed by green space. The sprawling development pattern of the last few decades is a decided departure from the long-term trend. Is that consistent with the testimony you talked about?
I'd agree. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And then finally, reading through the end of this, the shared goal of Land Use 2025 and the RIWAP is to return to a land use vision that promotes an urban-rural distinction, and in so doing leaves wild and other undeveloped places for future generations of Rhode Islanders and wildlife. As Rhode Island's primary plan for conservation and development in the 21st century, Land Use 2025 articulates, this, let me say, open quote, articulates the state's overarching goals, objectives, and strategies to guide and coordinate the land use plans and regulations of municipalities and state agencies, and to direct good strategic projects at both the state and municipal level, close quote. It is mandatory that the goals and policies of Land Use 2025 and all elements of the state guide plan be reflected in the municipal and comprehensive plans. Agree with that?
Yes.
And this, in fact, was important enough that it was restated almost in its entirety from Chapter 7 of the Wildlife Action Plan, correct?
Correct.
And do you know whether Burville's comp plan includes the goals and policies of Land Use 2025 and all elements of the state guide plan?
I'm not aware.
As part of your advisory opinion, you didn't look at the local comprehensive plans, is that correct?
No, I did not.
You would agree that one of the surest ways to protect land is to purchase it, right?
Correct. Can I just go back to that last question?
Yeah, sure.
I can't be certain that our staff, so our community liaison, who also drafted a fair amount of the response in the advisory opinion, that is her role. She may have looked at the comp plan. I did not.
And who is the community liaison?
Amanda Freitas.
Who does she work for?
She works collaboratively with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and the Rhode Island Natural History Survey. And she works through funding provided by the State Wildlife Grants Program, which was the funding used to create this plan.
I know she was listed here somewhere. Let's turn to page 26, section 4.1. That's entitled Land Acquisition in the middle of the page, correct?
Yes.
The first arrow there says, well, it starts with one of the surest ways to protect land is to purchase it. It's the first paragraph. It's important to prioritize land acquisition priorities, to consider some alternative options to outright ownership, and to explore all available funding sources.
Yes.
State the policy on land acquisition generally.
Generally, yes.
And then it says, in the first arrow, I guess we'll call that, use the maps and existing data to build support for efficient local land protection. Aim to protect sites with high-value habitat, corridors between important parcels, and lands adjacent to existing protected lands that could be combined to form core natural areas. Would that fall into the category of avoid, and the avoid and minimize scheme?
Sorry, just a second.
Take your time.
Yeah, if your intent was to avoid utilizing those criteria and those maps, that would be the first step that I would take.
And do you know if that was ever done by the town?
I do not.
Aside from flat-out acquisition, would you agree that best management practices would be another way to minimize impacts to the uplands, the area you're testifying about?
Yes.
And in that category, we think we've already talked about monitoring. The 10-year monitoring program was suggested by DEM, and the applicant has agreed to that.
Okay.
In terms of restoration.
Yeah.
And there's also another management practice.
I'm sorry, where is it that you're reading from?
Oh, I wasn't reading from it right now, but it's in the advisory opinion. We covered it earlier today. In two places, actually. One place is on page 23, which reads, the applicant has committed to a 10-year monitoring and management plan for both wetland and upland restorations. That's in the original advisory. Is that still correct, Mr. Osenkowski?
Is it correct that that was in the advisory opinion, or is it, what's the question?
Did I read it accurately? How's that?
Yeah, give me a second to find it.
The original opinion, top of page 23.
Could you reread it? I'm not, on page 23 of the original advisory opinion.
Correct. This was another one where Mr. Horbert threw you under the bus and said, I think this was your area.
I get a lot of those.
Yeah, I know. Page 23 starts, the applicant is committed. Do you have that?
Oh, I see it, yep.
So it says the applicant is committed to a 10-year monitoring and management plan for both wetland and upland restoration activities. Such a plan, if funded and executed effectively, would certainly assist with ensuring that issues like invasive species encroachment can be addressed in a timely manner. DEM still support a 10-year monitoring?
Yes, thanks for the recollection. Yeah, that's correct, and as a way to mitigate impacts once the project has already been constructed, that's the advisable course of action.
Is it fair to say that your opinion is that this project should not be built, correct?
I just believe, in my opinion, that a development in this area could have a negative impact on fish and wildlife in our overarching conservation efforts to protect large contiguous areas.
And whether or not it was a power plant, you feel that way about any development on that property that would involve deforestation?
Yes.
I think it was those Warwick invasive species that are making you sneeze. So. A few other items in terms of, again, the avoid and minimize construct, which Mr. Gray put forward for essentially the unregulated areas of the property. Avoidance, I think we talked about, could be conservation, acquisition, putting maybe even conservation easements on the property, correct?
Correct.
In the minimize category, which I want to talk about now, just talked about the 10-year monitoring. We also did talk about tree cutting times.
Yes.
Would minimizing the clearing of trees wherever possible also be another way to minimize
Yes.
impacts? Would surveying the site to identify any historic or special trees and find means to preserve them, would that be a mitigation?
Yes.
And if the timber is cleared, a means to put it to a beneficial economic use, would that be a mitigation? No. Or minimization, rather?
Could you repeat that?
When timber is cleared, seek a means to put it to a beneficial economic use.
As far as a way to minimize impacts to the habitat? I guess I don't see how that's beneficial.
Right, so you would disagree with that?
I suppose, if I understand it correctly.
And we already covered the fact that we're not using Woods Road. Instead, when you use the temporary access, you think that's at least positive in terms of minimizing some impacts?
I think that would be preferred over having two roads.
And would that also, could you also reforest the cleared areas as part of the restoration and mitigation of the property, correct?
Yes.
And part of that is covered under freshwater wetlands, but it could also be applied by this board to other areas outside of wetland jurisdiction, correct?
That's correct. That's fairly standard replanting.
And then finally, you could either conserve the remaining land on site or use off-site resources for mitigation, compensatory mitigation, correct?
Post-approval of a plan. I mean, it doesn't satisfy the impact that's already been created by construction of a project. So I don't believe that you can offset the impact by purchasing a property that's not contiguous with the area, for example. You've already, the impact of encroachment. So you can't necessarily offset that, although protecting more land's better. And if it were in an area that's high priority, has rare species or something like that, it could be beneficial. It doesn't necessarily equate to apples to apples.
Thank you.
I think earlier you said replanting is fairly standard. What do you mean by that?
You mentioned Mr. Harbert, and that's very standard for the wetland program of replant. It doesn't necessarily offset, again, disturbance from clearing and encroachment, but it provides vegetation. And typically it's in a way where it's a buffer. A lot of times it's more beneficial for the neighbor than the wildlife necessarily, but it can be used as a buffer from lighting and noise and other things.
And so among many of these things we've discussed, you would agree that there are methods to minimize impacts to the forest consistent with Mr. Gray's opinion to avoid and minimize to the maximum extent practicable, correct?
There are definitely options once the development is built to attempt to mitigate the impacts. But you're doing just that. You're mitigating impacts that you have already realized. So the impacts are the impacts. Can you lessen them by doing certain things? Yes. Certain lighting, covers, vegetation, planting, there are standard BMPs that you can implement.
So absent a no-build scenario,
Yep.
these mitigation or minimization and mitigation efforts you would deem appropriate?
Yes.
I have no further questions, thank you.
Chairperson, may I ask a couple of follow-up to Ms. Moon's questions?
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Jerry Elmer. I'm an attorney for Conservation Law Foundation. Has any question Ms. Noonan put to you today changed your opinion expressed this morning that you agree with Scott Cummings' written and oral testimony in this case?
No, I haven't changed my opinion. In agreement.
Did any document that Ms. Noonan showed you today change your opinion that you agreed with Scott Cummings' written and oral testimony in this case?
No.
Chairperson, I have no further questions, but I would request that the EFSB take administrative notice of the email that he was reading from this morning, copies of which have been distributed to all council. He relied on that in his testimony. It is clearly a document kept by DEM, a government agency, in the normal course of business, and is probably the best evidence about the matter that he was testifying about because he was reading from the email.
We can make it an exhibit, it doesn't have to be administrative notice.
CLF is, of course, indifferent on that point. We'd like to get it in.
The town agrees.
OER has no objection to it coming in either as an exhibit or administrative notice.
All right, then let's admit it as an exhibit. And that would be number?
219.
Town has no further questions.
I have a couple. So, you were just asked about whether you oppose any development on that property. The standard that we have, which I'm not familiar with in other environmental statutes at the state level, is whether this proposed facility will not cause unacceptable harm. So when other DEM witnesses testified, like Mr. Gray and Mr. Horvath, they were testifying about permit programs. But you're talking about, and it's been made clear, these are non-regulatory programs. So do you think that the construction of this facility, based on the impacts on wildlife habitat, poses unacceptable harm?
Yeah, so you're right in that what I'm testifying on, which was pointed out, we have really no regulatory jurisdiction, which coming from my experience in wetlands allows black and gray that you know where you can walk. From my perspective within the Division of Fish and Wildlife and evaluating impacts to habitat and fish and wildlife, it's my opinion that encroachment by a development, whether it's this sort of development, which comes with its own suite of impacts, or another sort of development, has negative impacts as a whole to the local area.
And what standards are you applying? And then we referenced the testimony, which Mr. Gray was asked about too, in regard to DEM's recommendation to us that we look at avoid, minimize, mitigate, and kind of take the foundational approach to looking at wetland impacts and apply it here. But I just wonder if you wanted to expound on that.
Related to standards in avoidance mitigation or determination of how a project would have negative impacts on fish and wildlife habitat or
Okay, I think I asked you 3 questions at once. All right, so let's start with, from your perspective, which is just one component part of the DEM opinion, how would you assess unacceptable harm? What standards would you use?
Yeah, oh man, that's so loaded. It's variable. I'm basing it based on the criteria that we have in the subject parcel in the area. It would be very different than evaluating a parcel here, for example. With regard to this project within the Western Block, I've kind of tried to establish the importance of these large contiguous forested areas. And with that comes the one of the greatest threats to them, to that type of situation, is fragmentation and encroachment. So from that perspective, that's sort of what my starting point. From that perspective, additional fragmentation and further encroachment into a core area has a negative impact. Because it's very different than a highly urbanized area that's already highly fragmented. Species associated with them have very different habitat requirements. The species that we're concerned with in those blocks, and the reason why those blocks are high priority from a fish and wildlife perspective, is that because of the amount of contiguous core habitat that's unfragmented, undisturbed, that provides the value to those species to meet their habitat needs, to persist. As you continue to encroach, you continue to threaten the persistence of those species.
Let me just follow up on that before I ask the second part. If this were a subdivision or a Home Depot, would you have an ability to weigh in on that?
No, I would not.
So now I'll get back to the your suggestion that we use, or the advisory opinion suggestion that we use the avoid, minimize, mitigate. You already spoke actually in response to all the two of the lawyers about ways of doing that. Is there anything further you'd want to advise this board, given your expertise on how to apply that construct to upland habitats?
Related to the project, you're looking for potential advice on how we could further, maybe not avoid, it sounds like, because I already stated that's the preferred option, but mitigate impacts. There are BMPs, and there's BMPs in literature. The applicant may already be aware of. Chuck in the wetlands program are very familiar with. So the standards are, like I said, there's lighting where you can cap lighting to try to limit the amount of lighting. There's plantings of vegetation, any road crossings where there's any wetlands, culverts and or box culverts, bridges if necessary, are all ways to mitigate impacts. There are a number of things that an applicant can do, assuming the project's going to be approved, to minimize. In the context of my concerns for area-sensitive species, none of those would satisfy the concern for area-sensitive species. And once the encroachment occurs, that's the issue, and that's the concern.
The applicant did submit an invasive species protection or control plan. Did you get a chance to look at that?
I did, but I don't know the details of it. I remember it being sort of online with the basic standards of invasive species control and monitoring to try to get a handle on that.
Did you also, we obviously just got something today actually for me on the proposed compensatory mitigation, so none of us have reviewed that, but did you see the earlier proposal in terms of the land acquisition?
I'm only vaguely familiar with it, and as I stated, in my opinion, that's sort of a token effort of, okay, well, if you can get something, then that would be helpful. It does not offset the concerns from allowing the project to go through.
Do you have any questions? I have to find a piece of paper.
Don't assume that there has been a decision. Given your knowledge as an expert, particularly on wildlife and forest fragmentation, would you characterize it as unacceptable harm to the environment? I believe you have stated that the preferred option is to avoid, but then expanded on mitigation. You have also stated that whatever development within this block would have negative impact, that none of the mentioned ways to mitigate impacts would satisfy the area-sensitive species.
Yeah, I would view it as unacceptable harm because I believe that avoidance is an option. I don't believe that whether it's this power plant or another project here on this site, that there's not other opportunities or options. And the detriment to the continuity of that habitat and the species that rely on that continuity, to me, is avoidable. And as a result, I think it's unacceptable.
Thank you.
I found my paper and I already asked the question.
What-
So thank you, Mr.
Thank
Osenkowski.
you.
I just had a question about the wildlife survey. You had indicated earlier some issues with it, that it's, I could go back and look at my notes, I suppose. You had noted that it was, although for the particular I'm gonna have to look at my notes.
Chairperson, I know it.
I can expand if while you're looking for your notes, if you'd like.
No, you commented that, for example, for the particular sampling techniques that were used, they were adequately done, but that overall, this survey was not adequate because it was so limited. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, most of the consultants' survey techniques were standard techniques. They weren't encompassing, though, of all. So there's various, I'll give you an example, and I'm going based on recollection, but for small mammals, for example, I believe they use camera trap surveys, which are basically set cameras up, and when something walks by, it takes a picture. The other trapping technique was utilizing Sherman traps. Looking at the consultant because I don't want to get this wrong based on the report, but those both have advantages and disadvantages. So there's other techniques that if you really want to be all-encompassing and do everything you can to identify the species, you'd also utilize body gripping traps, which are snap traps, more or less. And so there are biases with all these trapping methods. So that's one example where the techniques that were used were standard. They weren't fully encompassing of the array of trapping techniques to get a full comprehensive look at what mammals are using it. But then, like you stated, the time frames would need to be expanded, not only seasonally but across years, to gain greater confidence on inventorying the site adequately.
So given what was done for the particular inventory that is now in evidence, would it be more adequate if it included more time during the year?
Yes.
More than just the single period within a single season?
That's correct. So
it wouldn't have to be multi-year or capable of detecting all species on the site.
It would be my recommendation that it would be multi-year. And if you're looking to be comprehensive, then you would need to have a multi-year survey because of the changes within years. Some species, as I mentioned, are fairly cryptic. Other species you may miss just because of the timing of when you did your survey. You know, you might be within the right window, but whatever the conditions were for those days that you went out, they weren't the right conditions. So I get this a lot within my role, where I get asked for data. We have a long-standing data set of waterfowl in the state. We fly in a helicopter, do a one-day survey. The context of that is that it's plugged into a Atlantic-wide model for all states to contribute. So if you miss species at a particular area, it's not detrimental to the survey. But
Because somebody else will probably pick something up.
that's right. I mean, we're not looking at state populations. The survey was meant for larger regional population monitoring. But I get a lot of questions within our department about water quality issues, wanting to rely on that survey without really realizing the caveat is we flew over that pond once. Took me about 30 seconds, to fly over that. Yeah, we've been doing the survey for 50 years. If you look at the 50 years, you'll find we detected that. But if you look at that one data point for that 1 year, yeah, we missed it. So that's more or less the type of risk you're taking in doing a survey that's one season.
And that's more problematic, isn't it, for an area of high concern?
That's more problematic, that's right.
Thank you.
That leads me to one more question. And just to clarify, which I think you have, but even were we to have 5 years of data and see more state threatened and state endangered species, there's no statute or regulation or you know where I'm going to, yeah, exactly, that would require this applicant or another developer to actually conserve that habitat.
Unfortunately, that's correct. I think a few things that probably typically applicants go down a road of looking at our heritage program, which hasn't existed for at least 13 years, relying on data that was collected 30, 40 years ago maybe, and just in one of the caveats that we typically have to relay to people is that just because it wasn't detected really doesn't have any bearing on from the heritage program point of view. It could mean we never went there. It could mean we went there that day and we didn't detect it. Just because it's there or not there, there's always a caveat of you need to really understand the data so that it's not misinterpreted. So with regard to endangered and threatened species, unfortunately, we're in Rhode Island at a disadvantage among Northeast states where we really don't have any additional protection for species that are endangered or threatened. We have a listing, but they are afforded the same protection as any other species unless they're federally listed.
And you change that if you could.
I would change that in a heartbeat.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything further for this one?
I just brief follow-up. In regards to your discussion about, you were saying for, certain wildlife, you fly over once a year for 30 seconds and see something, and you wouldn't put that correct?
I stated that, yes.
You're certainly not suggesting that was done in the biodiversity story.
That was just an example of how you just have to be cautious on interpretation of data. And that's one of the biases that can come out of doing a survey that's not multi-year. Is that you don't detect it not because it wasn't there, it's because of the timing or just whatever it is for that given year. They really prefer to have multi-year, longer data sets to gain greater confidence.
And yet that suggestion for multi-year or several years, as you say in the advisory opinion at page 20, was not incorporated into the protocol that Mr. Gagnon issued that is set forth in Exhibit 213, correct?
No, that was not.
The chair pressed you on this question of unacceptable harm, which is one of the standards for this board, and you hesitated a bit in your answer, correct?
Correct.
And the response that you gave regarding unacceptable harm is nowhere in either the original or the supplemental advisory opinion from DEM, is it?
No. That was not my understanding of what we were responding to.
Thank you.
I do have one or two more, if I could follow up. Mr. Osenkowski, you assisted in the drafting of the supplemental advisory opinion as well as the original advisory opinion. correct?
Yes.
And the supplemental advisory opinion, as well as the original, but the most recent one is the supplemental, and it went out on August 15, 2017. Is that correct?
Yes.
So by the time the applicant had received the supplemental advisory opinion, the applicant was clearly aware, or should have been aware, that DEM was recommending that the time frame for the survey on site should have been extended, either to complete seasons or, as you had recommended, to more years, correct?
Correct. I'm not sure what they were aware of, but I know that's from my interaction in the advisory opinion, that's what we stated.
Yet, has DEM received any supplement at all to the summer of 2017 survey?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right, thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Osenkowski.
You're welcome.